Candlelight flickers over stone. A chapel breathes in silence. Beyond the stained glass, winter presses against the world, cold, endless, waiting. And in that hush, a woman kneels. Her crown glimmers not in gold, but in silver, the color of moonlight, of wisdom, of restraint. She is the calm at the heart of the storm. She is Blanche of Castile. Before queens became ornaments, one ruled as a master. Before saints were born, one was forged by her hands. In an age when men believed faith was frailty and power was a birthright of kings, she proved them all wrong. She was born of Spain, of crusaders and convents, where the air itself carried the scent of prayer and steel. But her destiny lay across the mountains, in a land divided by ambition and blood, France. There, her grace would become governance, her piety a weapon sharper than any sword. The chroniclers would call it providence, but history remembers it as will. Through veils of incense and shadow, her story moves not with the thunder of armies, but with the whisper of command. Her gaze could steady a council. Her silence could disarm a rebellion. She ruled with the patience of a saint and the precision of a general. When her husband's heart failed, France faltered. But she stood, alone, with a child in her arms and a crown at her feet. Every lord, every priest, every whisper conspired against her, yet she bent the realm to her quiet will. She did not reign from the throne of men. She reigned from the seat of conscience. Her kingdom was faith itself, structured, ordered, luminous. Under her rule, France became not merely a nation, but an idea that virtue could be sovereign, that the divine could dwell in discipline. She raised her son, Louis, in that image not to conquer the world, but to redeem it. And when he would ascend, history would name him saint. But behind every saint, there is a mother. Behind every kingdom of light, a shadow of sacrifice. Blanche's story is not of conquest, it is of control. Not of passion, but of purpose. Her crown was silver because it reflected the light of others, kings, crusaders, nations, while keeping none for herself. In a century of swords, she ruled with spirit. In a world of kings, she became the mother of France. And though time has softened her name, her legacy endures in marble, in scripture, in the soul of a nation that still prays in the cadence of her rule. This is the Silver Throne, Blanche of Castile and the Making of France. Like, share, subscribe, and join us where power bowed to virtue, where silence shaped kingdoms, and where one woman proved that faith could govern the world. The wind of Castile carried dust and prayer. Across the plains, banners rippled like fire, and monasteries crowned the distant hills white stone against the deep ochre earth. In that land of saints and swords, the child who would one day rule France was born. Blanche entered the world beneath the ringing of church bells, their echoes folding into the cries of a newborn kingdom still haunted by war. Her cradle stood between altar and battlefield. Her mother, Queen Eleanor of England, daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, had brought with her the fierce pride of Plantagenet blood and the unbroken will of women who shaped dynasties. From her father, King Alfonso of Castile, Blanche inherited a devotion carved from duty, faith as discipline, not comfort. She was not raised among courtiers who whispered of pleasure or poets who sang of love. Her childhood was austere, deliberate, a tapestry woven of Latin psalms, long fasts, and the measured weight of expectation. The women who tutored her spoke not of romance, but of sacrifice. They taught her that beauty fades but virtue commands, that a queen's silence could wound more deeply than a man's sword. In the sun-washed corridors of the royal convents, she learned how power moves unseen, how charity could disarm envy, and purity could bind allegiance stronger than any oath. The world around her preached humility, yet from the moment Blanche first knelt in prayer, her humility was forged into armor. Beyond the convent walls, Castile was restless. The Reconquista raged in the south, where Christian banners advanced against Moorish citadels. From the north came messengers of Rome, calling for crusades in the name of faith. In every sermon, the priests spoke of duty, of divine right, of kingdoms won through obedience to God. Blanche listened, but she heard something different, not submission, but order. To her, God's will was not a chain, it was a structure, and she would learn to build within it. Her mother watched in silence, understanding what she had birthed. There was steel beneath that serenity, a fire clothed in white linen. Eleanor saw it first when Blanche, barely 8, stood beside a dying pilgrim brought to the gates of Burgos. The child neither flinched nor wept. She whispered a prayer, closed his eyes, and commanded the servants to feed the man's horse before tending to her own meal. Even then, she understood that mercy, to rule, must be methodical. The court called her La Blanca Flor, the white flower. But flowers wilt, Blanche did not. While her sisters embroidered and sang, she memorized decrees and traced the seals of treaties her father signed. She studied the maps of France and England, of Aragon and Leon, her young mind already measuring the web of alliances that determined peace. The chroniclers of her youth would later write that she possessed the calm of marble and the eyes of her grandmother, the great Aquitaine queen who once ruled half of Europe. But Blanche was no reflection of past glory, she was the refinement of it. Every lesson, every prayer, every glance from her tutors carved her into purpose. She grew not toward vanity, but toward destiny. In the Cathedral of Toledo, she watched her father kneel before the altar, his sword placed upon the stone as a pledge to God. The gesture burned into her, that to serve heaven was not weakness, but strategy. Faith could justify power. Faith could command obedience. And obedience, if properly shaped, could move empires. Outside, Castile shimmered in the heat of summer, a kingdom of dust and devotion. Blanche moved among its cloisters like a figure of calm within a storm, unyielding even as politics shifted around her. She absorbed the discipline of monks, the patience of priests, and the vigilance of queens who knew that love was fleeting but duty eternal. When envoys from France arrived, their banners marked with the fleur-de-lis, Blanche watched them from behind the carved screens of the chapel. They had come seeking peace and a bride. France was weary, its alliances fractured, its king desperate to bind himself to the bloodline of Castile. Among Alfonso's daughters, one shone not for beauty, but for composure. Blanche listened to the negotiations unfold, her small hands folded in prayer. She knew already what it meant. A crossing, a sacrifice, a life surrendered to another court, another crown, but there was no fear in her. She had been raised for this. Her mother had whispered it for years. You were not born to belong, but to bind. When word came that the French king had chosen her, not her elder sister, not another noble's child, the palace erupted in ceremony. But within Blanche, there was only stillness. She went to the chapel that night, alone, and knelt before the Virgin's statue. The candles flickered around her, the air heavy with incense. She did not pray for joy. She prayed for strength. The following weeks blurred into ritual, the weaving of gowns, the forging of dowry lists, the whispered farewells. Her father blessed her with a sword in his hands, a rare gesture for a daughter. Her mother wept only once, in secret, and said nothing more. In that silence lay the passing of a dynasty's will from one queen to another, yet unproven. As she prepared to leave Castile, Blanche walked once more through the palace gardens. The olive trees bent in the wind, their silver leaves catching the dawn. She paused beside the fountain, watching the reflection of the sky tremble upon the water's surface. For a moment, she thought she saw two faces, her own and that of a woman older, crowned, unyielding, a premonition, or perhaps memory waiting to be born. She touched the water, breaking the image, and turned away. Behind her lay childhood discipline, faith, preparation. Before her, the mountains of destiny. She was 12 years old, and the road to France awaited. Before she ruled France, she learned to master herself. The road to France cut through mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. The Pyrenees loomed like the edge of the world, snow-streaked ridges carved by wind and prayer. For Blanche, The journey was not a procession of celebration, but of passage. Every turn of the road carried her farther from Castile's sunlight and closer to the shadowed courts of the north. The air grew colder. The language around her shifted, thick with foreign rhythm. Knights rode ahead beneath banners marked with lilies of gold, their armor clattering against the rhythm of the horses' hooves. Behind them, Blanche rode alone beneath a white mantle, her gaze steady upon the horizon. No tears, no hesitation, only resolve. At the border fortress, monks came out to bless her. They sprinkled holy water on the travelers and murmured in Latin. Blanche bowed her head not out of submission, but acknowledgement, as if even heaven must witness this crossing. One life had ended, another began. As the mountains fell away behind her, France unfolded vast, fertile, layered with mist. Where Castile was sun and austerity, France was softness and intrigue. Fields of wheat rolled beneath gray skies. Villages clustered around old stone churches, and every shadow seemed to hide a secret. At every stop, the people came to see her. They whispered of her youth, her poise, her resemblance to queens long gone. She met their gaze without fear, not as a child paraded for alliance, but as one who understood she carried the burden of peace. By the time she reached Bordeaux, songs were already spreading ahead of her. They called her La Jeune Reine d'Espagne, the young Spanish queen, though her crown was not yet placed. Even before she entered Paris, the legend had begun. The French court awaited her at Fontainebleau. Stone towers rose from a sea of forest, banners rippling in a northern wind. The palace smelled of incense and damp wood, colder, grander, older than anything she had known. Inside, courtiers glittered like mirrors, each smile polished, each word barbed. When Blanche entered, all conversation stopped. The girl of 12 carried herself like marble come to life. Her gown shimmered in white and silver, her hair bound by a simple circlet of gold. Around her, nobles bowed not to beauty but to composure. Louis, her betrothed, stood before her kind-eyed, quiet, a prince whose soul leaned toward prayer rather than power. Blanche regarded him with calm curiosity. He was not weak, only untested. She saw in him the reflection of a realm searching for direction and, perhaps, a husband who would one day need her strength to rule. The ceremony was swift, sacred, inevitable. The archbishop's voice echoed through the chapel, mingling Latin with destiny. When Blanche's small hand touched the prince's, a murmur spread through the gathered lords. The alliance between Castile and France had been sealed not by bloodshed, but by a child's poise. That night, torches flared across the gardens of Fontainebleau. Feasts were held, troubadours sang, and noblewomen whispered in clusters, studying the girl who had crossed mountains to become their future queen. Blanche sat beside her new husband, smiling when she must, silent when she chose, every gesture measured, every word deliberate. Already she was learning the rhythm of the French court, a theater of glances, where power moved not in decrees, but in tones, pauses, and silence. She watched how the barons bowed too low before the king, how the bishops lingered too long in council, how the ladies spoke in riddles of devotion while hiding daggers of gossip. It was not a kingdom of knights and crusaders like her father's. It was a realm of politics, and she understood instinctively that she must master this art as she had mastered devotion. Louis, gentle and hesitant, adored her. He prayed beside her, walked with her in the gardens, and spoke softly of duty. But it was Blanche who carried the composure of command. Where he faltered, she steadied him. Where he hesitated, she smiled, and in that smile, she ruled. Yet even as she learned to navigate this new world, she felt the eyes of the court upon her, measuring, doubting, testing. The French nobles called her l'étranger, the foreignee. They mocked her accent, her gravity, her refusal to indulge in the light-hearted vanity of Parisian ladies. But Blanche endured, for she knew that respect was not given to women like her. It was built, stone by stone, until it could not be ignored. At night, when the palace slept, she would rise and walk alone through the corridors lit by dying candles. She traced her fingers along the cold stone walls, whispering prayers in the tongue of her childhood. She thought of her mother's last words, "Bind them." And she realized now that binding a kingdom required patience greater than war. Days turned into weeks. Blanche's reputation grew not as a beauty, but as a mind. She remembered every name, every alliance, every slight. She listened more than she spoke, storing words like arrows. And in silence, she became the most dangerous presence in the room, not because she commanded armies, but because she understood men. One winter morning, she rode with Louis through the woods beyond Paris. The frost glimmered on the branches like glass. They came upon a group of peasants repairing a bridge, their faces rough, their hands raw. Louis dismounted to offer alms. Blanche watched quietly. When he reached to help one man lift a stone, she saw the awe in their eyes, not for the prince, but for his kindness. And she understood then what her reign might one day be. Power need not roar. It could guide. It could heal. It could wear the mask of virtue and still command obedience. That night, she stood at the window of her chamber, gazing over the rooftops of Paris. The city spread below her like a sea of prayer and ambition. She thought of the saints who had built cathedrals, of the kings who had burned for glory, and of the countless women whose names history would never recall. But hers, she vowed, would be remembered not as ornament, but as architect. Behind her, Louis entered quietly, unaware of the storm forming beside him. She turned, her face serene, her eyes already centuries ahead. In the silence of the court, she discovered the sound of power. Paris awakened beneath a veil of mist. The river ran silver through the city's heart, and the bells of Notre Dame tolled over rooftops damp with dawn. In the palace, tapestries fluttered against drafts of winter air images of saints, crusaders, and queens long gone, their woven faces staring down as if to judge the living. Blanche stood among them now, the foreign bride who had become France's newest ornament. Yet even ornament cast shadows. The court of France was not built on honor. It was a labyrinth of flattery, rumor, and ambition wrapped in silk. Every corridor whispered. Every gesture meant something unseen. And Blanche, barely a woman, understood that she had been cast into a play where affection was a form of strategy, and every ally wore a smile edged with poison. Her husband, Louis, was gentle and devout, a man who found solace in prayer more than politics. He spoke kindly to everyone and trusted too easily. The nobles adored him for his innocence, because innocence could be shaped. But they feared his wife. Her calm unnerved them. Her eyes, pale and unreadable, seemed to strip the varnish off their words. She spoke little, but when she did, her tone carried a gravity that silenced jesters and scholars alike. In a world of men addicted to noise, her silence became power. At banquets, she watched how alliances formed and dissolved like smoke. The Duke of Burgundy feigned loyalty while trading secrets with England. The Bishop of Beauvais murmured of divine right yet bartered indulgences in gold. Even the ladies in waiting, sweet-faced and perfumed, traded gossip like currency. Blanche memorized them all, every glance, every whisper. She did not confront, she absorbed. She did not scheme, she prepared. There were those who mocked her piety, calling her the Spanish nun, but they mistook restraint for weakness. Her faith was not submission, it was discipline. She prayed not out of fragility, but as a queen might sharpen a sword. In the chapel, beneath flickering candles, she knelt in silence long after others had gone. Behind closed eyes, she measured her next move, the subtle nods, the quiet corrections, the whispered words that would bend the court toward her. Every act of humility concealed intention. Every prayer was strategy disguised as virtue. Outside, France simmered. The barons resented royal authority. The church demanded coin. England watched from across the channel, waiting for weakness. And in the midst of this storm, Blanche, the outsider, had to learn to rule a world that would never welcome her. The first blow came quietly, a rumor, soft as silk, spreading from one noble salon to the next. They whispered that Blanche's Spanish advisors plotted against France, that she sought to sway Louis toward Castile's interests, that her devotion masked ambition. She never acknowledged it. To answer gossip was to dignify it. Instead, she tightened her composure, colder smiles, slower words, longer silences. In the court of appearances, indifference was domination. But behind the walls of her chamber, she allowed herself a single tear, not for sorrow, but for calculation. She now understood the rules of this new kingdom: survival through perception. Virtue, when seen by the wrong eyes, could be turned into threat. And yet, she endured. Months passed. The city softened to her presence. Her charity to the poor became legend, not ostentatious, but quiet, constant. She visited monasteries, rebuilt orphanages, funded schools for clerics. And with each act of mercy, she built something far more lasting than favor. She built loyalty. Paris began to murmur a new title: La Reine Blanche, the White Queen. They meant it as praise. But Blanche heard something deeper in the name: not innocence, but clarity. White did not hide stains, it revealed them. One evening, the king summoned his council, the chamber filled with bishops and barons, parchment and pride. France stood at a crossroads, the treasury empty, the provinces restless. Louis hesitated, uncertain whom to trust. Blanche sat at his side, veiled in silver, listening. Each noble proposed his own solution: higher taxes, more leniency to England, less power to the church. Arguments collided like clashing swords. And then, when the noise reached its height, Blanche spoke. Her words were few, measured, icy. A kingdom divided by greed cannot stand beneath heaven's eyes. The room fell still. Even the candles seemed to quiet their flame. She turned to the king, her voice low, unwavering. Give nothing to those who sell loyalty by the ounce. Let the crown's mercy fall where obedience begins. It was the first time the court had heard her speak with authority. And from that day, the queen ceased to be an ornament. She became the mind at the king's shoulder, the mirror in which every noble saw his own reflection, sharpened to judgment. In private, Louis confessed admiration. He had never known such certainty. She smiled, neither flattered nor proud, and replied softly that God gives clarity to those who carry duty without fear. He believed her, but others did not. For in that moment, the balance of France had shifted imperceptibly, irrevocably. The courtiers still bowed to Louis, but they began to glance toward Blanche before speaking. And she, serene and silent, received their gestures with the calm of one who already ruled. Yet she felt the weight of it. In her chamber that night, she knelt again in prayer, her fingers pressed against cold marble, not for forgiveness, for strength. The wind outside howled through the palace courtyards. She listened, eyes closed, whispering to the God her enemies claimed she used as shield. Perhaps she did, but even heaven, she knew, answered only the resolute. Before she ruled France, the voice of history would one day murmur. She learned to master herself. Winter deepened. Snow fell over Paris like a blessing and a curse, muffling the city's noise beneath a white stillness. Inside the royal palace, the firelight trembled across gilded panels and cold stone. And in that glow, the Queen of France began her quiet conquest. Blanche had learned that rule was not won by decrees, but by patience. While her husband prayed, she listened. While the nobles feasted, she planned. Every gesture, a pause, a word, a lowered gaze, became a move in the game of survival. She built alliances in silence, with the abbots who fed the poor in her name, with the artisans who carved her image into chapel glass, with the mothers who whispered to their children that their queen was holy, unbending, kind. Power did not lie in the council chambers. It lived in the streets, in faith, in perception. Yet the court did not rest. Every triumph birthed envy, and envy wore 1,000 faces. One of them was Pierre de Mauclair, Duke of Brittany, clever, charming, and treacherous. He had once bowed before the crown, but now whispered of liberty for his duchy. In his hall by the sea, he gathered discontented lords and spoke of ancient rights of kings who forgot their place, of queens who forgot their sex. He called Blanche the Castilian Frost. And frost, he warned, could kill a kingdom if left too long in shadow. When news of his defiance reached Paris, Louis wavered. He wished for peace. He believed men could be reasoned with. But Blanche knew better. Weakness is mercy given to the undeserving, she told him one night as the bells tolled midnight. And mercy, my lord, when misplaced, is treason to the crown. Her words struck deep, not cruelly, but with truth that cut like steel. The next day, the king's banner was raised. The royal army marched west. Blanche did not ride with them. She stayed in Paris not by fear, but by necessity. In war, swords may win battles, but in absence, rumors can lose kingdoms. While France fought Brittany, the queen guarded the throne. Every letter sealed, every courier questioned. The treasury balanced to the last coin. Her council met under her eye bishops, stewards, and the wary nobles who dared not oppose her now. They found her relentless. She rose before dawn, fasted during Lent, and spent hours at Mass before turning to matters of state. She was disciplined to the edge of exhaustion, as if driven by a vow no one else could hear. Whispers began again this time, not of her origins, but of her will. Too proud, some said, too cold, others murmured. But even her enemies found themselves obeying before they realized it. Because discipline, in a world addicted to indulgence, was terrifying. Then came a letter. It arrived in the dead of night, carried by a weary messenger from the front. Brittany had fallen. The Duke was defeated. Louis would return within the week. Paris rejoiced. The bells of Notre Dame thundered over the river, and processions filled the streets. But in the palace, Blanche did not smile. For she knew victory carried its own dangers, the arrogance of the triumphant, the resentment of the humbled. And somewhere, beyond the sea, England watched still. When the king returned, garlanded in triumph, she greeted him not as a wife, but as a sovereign. Her words were simple. France stands whole, my lord. Now let us make her strong. Louis kissed her hand and called her his blessing. The courtiers echoed the praise. But even as they knelt, they wondered who truly ruled this realm. Time moved like a tide. Children were born, wars faded into uneasy peace, and Blanche's power deepened with each passing season. Her son, little Louis, grew beneath her gaze, quiet and watchful. She told him stories of saints and kings, of duty, faith, and the price of mercy. He listened more than he spoke, and when he smiled, it was with the same calm certainty that lived in her. But not all hearts were loyal. A faction within the court led by nobles who resented her influence began to conspire. They saw the king's piety as weakness, the queen's strength as threat, and so, in whispers and coded letters, they plotted to divide the crown from within. Their leader was Count Thibaut of Champagne, a poet, a noble, and a man who believed charm could rewrite truth. He spoke softly, wove verses of honor and chivalry, and behind the music of his words, he planted seeds of rebellion. He courted allies, the younger barons hungry for glory, the bishops who longed for autonomy. They would not strike openly. They would wound her with elegance by isolating her, turning Louis's heart toward them, and painting her devotion as tyranny. It began subtly. Letters went missing. Messages were delayed. Rumors rekindled that Blanche kept the king under her control, that France was ruled by a Castilian hand beneath a French crown. Louis, caught between love and doubt, faltered. He withdrew into longer prayers, as if silence could reconcile loyalty and affection. But faith could not protect him from politics. Blanche saw it happening, felt it in every curt bow, every careful smile that no longer reached the eyes. And for the first time, fear entered her. Not for herself, but for the crown. She met Thibaut in the Hall of Mirrors, beneath banners painted with lilies and gold. Her voice was steady, her expression calm, but her words burned. "Do not mistake silence for blindness, my lord. France has long memories. The soil remembers who sows division." He smiled the practiced, courtly smile of a man who had never faced consequence. "I serve France, my queen." "Then serve her well," she said, "before she buries you for treason." The air between them froze, and though the courtiers watching laughed softly, they understood this was no jest. The weeks that followed were a contest of wills. Thibaut wrote songs of lost virtue. Blanche answered with decrees that tightened royal control. He gathered nobles at feasts. She gathered priests in councils. His influence spread through charm, hers through inevitability. And when the storm finally broke, when his followers rose in defiance, it was Blanche who called the banners, not the king. Louis hesitated, torn by friendship. She did not. France could not afford another civil wound. The rebellion was crushed before it began. Thibaut was exiled, his verses banned, his estates seized. The message was clear. The White Queen did not forgive twice. That night, alone in her chamber, Blanche looked out over Paris. The snow had melted. The city glowed beneath the moon, fragile, eternal. She wondered, just for a moment, what peace might feel like. But queens, she knew, were not made for peace. Their crowns were forged in struggle, their hearts in solitude. And somewhere deep within her, she felt the faint tremor of destiny yet to come. A shadow, distant but approaching. One day, France would test her beyond all measure. But not yet. For now, the White Queen ruled, and the world obeyed. Paris, spring. The bells of Notre Dame rang for a dying king. Louis VIII lay upon his bed, wrapped in silk and prayer. His breath came slow, burdened by fever and failure. Beside him, Blanche knelt, her face lit by the trembling flame of a single candle. Around them, courtiers whispered of inheritance, of regency, of power soon to be claimed. The chamber smelled of wax and myrrh. Outside, the city held its breath. A king was dying, and with him, the fragile balance of a kingdom. When the priest whispered the last rites, Blanche closed her eyes. Her hand did not tremble. She had wept once, long ago, when she was still a girl of Castile. But the woman kneeling beside France's dying monarch had no tears left to give. Louis murmured her name. His final words were a plea not for salvation, but for trust. For her to guide their son. For her to hold the kingdom. When the candle guttered, a silence fell that felt like the ending of an age. The attendants bowed. The priests crossed themselves. And Blanche rose, straight-backed and pale, already more sovereign than widow. The boy, young Louis IX, watched from the doorway, his small hands clasped in prayer, his eyes too old for his years. In that moment, mother and son understood what history demanded of them. The funeral of a king was a pageant of hypocrisy. Gold, incense, hymns, all disguising the scent of ambition. Nobles wept for their sovereign, while counting how many soldiers they could command once the crown passed to a child. The banners of France drooped in mourning, but the Lord's eyes glittered with calculation. Blanche watched them all from beneath her veil. Every bow, every glance, every whispered alliance. She recognized danger dressed as courtesy, rebellion hiding behind ritual. When the coffin descended into the cathedral crypt, a chill wind rose through the aisles. She felt it not as cold, but as warning. France would test her now, and France had never been merciful to queens. The coronation of the child king was hurried, fearful. At Reims, the sacred oil gleamed upon Louis's forehead, while Blanche stood beside him, not as ornament, but as shield. The archbishop's voice echoed, "Long live Louis, ninth of his name." King of the Franks. But in the silence that followed, the unspoken truth was clear. France did not yet belong to Louis. It belonged to the men who would try to rule in his name, or to the woman who would refuse them all. The Regency Council convened in the Hall of Justice. Marble columns towered like judgment. The lords entered one by one, tall, armored, and arrogant. They bowed only because ceremony required it. Count Philip of Boulogne, the king's uncle, Hugh of Lusignan, warlord of Poitou, and behind them the ever-restless Duke of Brittany returned, unpunished, unrepentant. They came not to serve, but to divide. At the head of the chamber, Blanche sat upon the silver throne. Her crown gleamed, but her gaze shone brighter still. She was dressed not in jewels, but in the pale austerity of mourning, the garb of faith, not vanity. She began softly, her voice neither loud nor pleading, but absolute. The king is young, yet the kingdom is eternal. France has no time for discord. Those who love the crown will serve it. Those who do not will be remembered. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence of the room thickened until it became its own decree. That was how she ruled, not through threats, but through the unbearable weight of certainty. But certainty invited hatred. The lords met in secret halls, whispering of rebellion. They claimed she was foreign, that she sought to enslave France beneath the yoke of Spanish pride and priestly council. They wrote letters to England, to the emperor, even to Rome. Blanche knew because she read them all before they were sent. Her network was invisible, loyal only to her. Messengers, abbots, scribes, the quiet shadows of the court, who owed their rise to her grace and their silence to her power. She learned every rumor, every lie, every plot before it reached her enemies' ears. And when rebellion finally stirred, she was already waiting. It began in the west, a gathering of banners beneath the red lion of Brittany and the gold cross of Lusignan. They proclaimed that France must be free from the tyranny of the widow. They swore they fought for the boy king's liberty, though they sought only his crown. The rebellion swept across the countryside, castles burned, villages emptied, and the roads filled with fear. Yet in Paris, Blanche did not flee. She summoned what soldiers remained, rallied the clergy, and called upon the faith of the people. From the pulpits of every church, priests spoke her words. The queen fights not for herself, but for France. To rise against her is to rise against God. The cities answered. Men who owned nothing but faith took up arms for her. They marched beneath no banner but the cross. And at their head rode Blanche, veiled, unarmed, but unyielding. Her presence alone steadied the soldiers. They called her the White Lioness, the Mother of France. To see her in the field silent, resolute, was to believe victory had already been promised. The battle was brief, brutal, decisive. Outside angers, the rebel lords broke beneath the discipline she had forged. When they were brought before her chained, defiant, she did not gloat. She simply said, "France forgives, but never forgets." They were released, their titles kept, their pride destroyed. Mercy in her hands was punishment enough. The rebellion ended. The boy king's throne stood secure. But Blanche's own legend began. In the months that followed, she rebuilt what war had scarred. She restored order to the treasury, justice to the courts, and dignity to the crown. Every decree she issued carried both authority and grace. She ruled in her son's name, yet everyone knew it was her will that shaped the realm. From Paris to Provence, they spoke her name in awe. The monks called her Sancta Regina, the Holy Queen. The barons called her the Iron Widow, and the people called her Mother France. Each name was true. Ach Name incomplete. At night, when the palace lay silent and her son slept beside a wooden crucifix, Blanche walked the corridors alone. She would pause at the window overlooking the Seine, watching the torches burn along the city's edge. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, pale, regal, untouchable. And beneath that mask, fatigue lived quietly. She was only 40, yet her eyes belonged to someone centuries old. Every prayer she whispered was not for victory, but for endurance. for the strength to keep the world from collapsing not through blood, but through will. For she knew what few ever understood, that the hardest part of ruling was not triumph, but persistence. And persistence was the one virtue God demanded most fiercely from those he favored. The rebellion had been quelled, yet peace was a brittle thing as fragile as the glass of a cathedral window. Every pane caught the light, yet one blow could shatter it all. Blanche knew this. She ruled not with illusion, but with vigilance. From dawn until the last bell of Compline, she moved through the palace with the precision of a ritual. Every word she spoke was measured, every silence deliberate. The lords who once mocked her foreign tongue now bent the knee at her summons. Even the church, that ancient and patient power, began to move according to her rhythm. In the heart of Paris, the court was transforming. Once a stage for vanity and war, it became a school of order and virtue. Blanche demanded piety, but not the kind that hid behind cloisters. Hers was a living faith, sharpened by intellect and tempered by strategy. She surrounded her son with tutors, monks, philosophers, men who spoke of justice, mercy, and reason. Each morning, young Louis read the scriptures beneath her gaze, then trained in the courtyard with knights who owed their loyalty not to birth, but to belief. In him, she was crafting something greater than a ruler. She was shaping a soul that could endure both crown and cross. Yet the court watched with envy. The idea of a woman commanding the destiny of France was an offense wrapped in awe. Some saw holiness, others saw heresy, but none could deny her command. When the papal envoy came to Paris, a cardinal in crimson silk, he expected to find a grieving widow in need of Rome's counsel. Instead, he found a sovereign cloaked in quiet defiance. She met him in the hall of mirrors, her reflection multiplied into infinity. Behind her stood the boy king, solemn as a statue. The envoy spoke of papal protection, of divine oversight for the young monarch. Blanche listened, then answered with the serenity of one who already knew she held heaven's favor. "France is not orphaned," she said. "For as long as God gives me breath, she will not kneel to any throne but her own." The envoy left in silence. Within days, a letter from Rome arrived, praising the queen's devotion and affirming her regency in full. Faith, once used to control her, had become her weapon. But power, once tasted, invites its own peril. In the south, the embers of the Albigensian heresy still smoldered. Old wounds reopened barons, testing the strength of her rule. The church urging another crusade. Blanche saw through both ambitions. She refused to drench France again in blood for the vanity of zealots or nobles. Instead, she chose diplomacy where men would have chosen war. Her emissaries traveled by moonlight, carrying letters sealed with her cross. They offered clemency to the guilty, mercy to the wavering, and justice to those long betrayed. Where swords would have failed, parchment prevailed. The rebellion faded not by battle, but by belief in her. Yet victory brought no rest. The queen's life was a constant balancing of devotion and danger. Her son's childhood was brief, carved away by the responsibilities of rule. When he laughed, she smiled. When he prayed, she wept in secret. For every moment of tenderness was stolen from the edge of duty. At night, she would walk the cloisters of Notre Dame, her veil brushing the cold stone walls. Candles flickered in the chapels, their flames trembling like fragile hearts. She would kneel not before icons of kings or martyrs, but before the Virgin herself. For Blanche saw in Mary the mirror of her own struggle, a mother whose love bore the weight of a kingdom. "You knew sorrow," she whispered. "Teach me strength." It was said that in those hours, the cathedral seemed to breathe as if France itself knelt beside her. Her enemies called her the saint of statecraft. Her allies called her the steel Madonna. Neither insult nor praise changed her purpose. She governed through letters and laws, through symbols and silence. When famine struck the northern provinces, she diverted royal funds to feed the hungry, but ordered that the relief be given through the church, not the crown. Faith would deliver what power could not, and in doing so, both would belong to her. The chronicles of monks began to speak her name with reverence once reserved only for kings. Under the silver hand of Blanche, one wrote, France found its soul, but even the strongest hand trembles when tested by the world's cruelty. In winter, word came from Poitou, another uprising, led by the same lords who had sworn loyalty on the Holy Gospel. Their banners flew again, this time joined by mercenaries from across the Channel. The Queen's counselors urged caution. Retreat. She answered with pilgrimage. Leaving the safety of Paris, she rode to Chartres, not to command armies, but to command hearts. Barefoot, veiled, she climbed the cathedral steps as snow fell upon her shoulders. The people knelt as she passed, blessing her as though she were already canonized. Inside, before the relic of the Virgin's veil, she prayed aloud, "If I must fight again, let it not be for vengeance, but for France." By dawn, soldiers were already gathering at the gates. Word of her courage spread faster than any decree. When her armies marched south, they marched not for conquest but for her. The rebellion crumbled before it began. No sword could rise against a queen who seemed to carry God himself in her stead. After victory, she returned to Paris in silence. The bells rang for triumph, but she forbade celebration. Instead, she ordered alms for the widows and orphans of the fallen. Her mercy was not weakness, it was discipline. It reminded France that she ruled by grace, not pride. That night, she stood beside her son on the balcony of the palace. The city glowed beneath them, torches, rooftops, the slow shimmer of the Seine. Louis looked up at her, his voice quiet, uncertain. "Mother," he said, "they call you blessed." She looked down at him, her face serene in the starlight. "Then remember," she whispered, "blessing is not peace, it is burden." That was the truth of her reign. Every triumph carried the weight of sacrifice. She had turned faith into power, power into order, but the cost was her solitude. The courtiers obeyed her. The church praised her. The people adored her. But no one truly saw her. And yet, in the heart of that loneliness, she found her calling a purpose larger than any crown. She was not merely regent. She was guardian of France's soul. By the year's end, the kingdom stood stronger than it had in decades. Trade revived, justice returned, and the royal seal of Blanche carried more fear and more faith than the sword of any man. The chronicles would call it the reign before the reign, the age when France was ruled not by might, but by the sanctity of a mother's will. Her throne was silver, her rule eternal. The palace bells tolled before dawn. Their sound rolled over the Seine like morning itself, a slow, solemn dirge that clung to every street, every prayer, every breath. The king was dead. Louis VIII, son of a crusader, husband to a Castilian rose, was gone, taken not by sword or treason, but by fever and exhaustion, a monarch undone by the weight of his own campaigns. And in that single morning, France changed. The throne stood empty, the crown without a master. In the great hall, draped in black velvet, Blanche of Castile stood alone beside her husband's coffin. The courtiers lingered at a distance, their whispers hushed but poisonous. Some wept, most calculated, for in the absence of a king, the scent of power is as strong as blood. Her veil concealed her face, but not her resolve. She did not weep, not before them. The queen who had once been mocked as foreign now stood as the axes upon which the kingdom turned. Behind her, the boy who would be King Louis, pale and solemn, only 12, trembled beneath the weight of the crown that would soon be his. The archbishop approached with the royal seal. He spoke the words of protocol, of tradition and divine succession. When he extended the seal toward her, Blanche's hand did not hesitate. She took it, and with it, the burden of France. "The king is dead," she said, her voice steady as marble. "But the crown endures." In that single act, she transformed mourning into mandate. The regency had begun. The days that followed were a storm of fear and calculation. Every noble weighed his loyalty against ambition. Every foreign envoy waited for weakness to appear. The English crown, ever hungry for French soil, whispered to rebellious barons in the west. Within weeks, the realm threatened to fracture again, a kingdom of vultures circling a child and a widow. But Blanche was no prey. From the first council she convened, she ruled with a calm that disarmed even her enemies. Her voice was soft, but her command absolute. She appointed no new favorites, dismissed no old allies. She listened. She learned, and when she finally spoke, her words struck with the precision of a blade. "France does not wait for a man to lead her," she told the council. "She has her queen." A murmur ran through the chamber, disbelief, then submission. The regent had spoken, and the crown had chosen her. But power, once claimed, must be proven. The first test came swiftly. Rebellion in the heart of the realm. The barons of Poitou and Anjou rose again, led by men who called themselves defenders of the old order. They claimed to act for the young king's protection. In truth, they sought to unmake the very throne that gave them name and land. Blanche summoned her captains. Some advised negotiation, others demanded force. She chose both. Letters went forth in her name, firm, eloquent, relentless. They reminded the nobles of their oaths, their faith, and their honor. Those who hesitated received mercy. Those who defied her received silence, the silence that comes before wrath. Within months, her armies marched under the fleur-de-lis, led by generals who had once doubted her courage. And behind them rode her standard, a silver cross embroidered on white silk. The men called it the banner of the Queen's prayer. But in the fields of rebellion, it became something else entirely, a sign that even heaven feared her conviction. She traveled with the army, not as a warrior, but as its conscience. At every camp, she prayed before the soldiers, barefoot upon the frozen earth. When one knight asked why she risked herself among the ranks, she answered simply, "A mother does not abandon her child nor her kingdom." The campaign was short and brutal. The rebels, expecting hesitation from a woman, found instead precision and discipline. Each city that surrendered was spared. Each traitor who repented was pardoned. But those who betrayed twice met the sword. Mercy, to Blanche, was not softness. It was strategy. By the time spring returned, France had quieted again, not through terror, but through awe. The nobles began to whisper a new name for her, the Iron Hand in the Veil. When she returned to Paris, the city greeted her with bells and banners. Yet the celebration brought her no joy. Her husband was gone. Her son's childhood was slipping away beneath the weight of his crown. And she, the queen who had saved the kingdom, found no comfort except in faith. She ordered the royal chapel reopened and its relics restored. In the glow of the candles, she knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tight enough to draw blood. The monks who watched said her lips never ceased moving a litany, not of sorrow, but of command. For Blanche prayed not for peace, but for endurance. She knew that rule was not granted once. It had to be earned every day anew. Yet not all battles were fought with swords or decrees. In the corridors of the palace, subtle wars began to brew. Courtiers resented her discipline. Clerics envied her influence over Rome. Even her son, bright, devout, and increasingly independent, began to strain against the chains of her guardianship. He wished to ride, to hunt, to rule. She wished to mold him still. Their love became a contest of wills, silent, profound, inevitable. In the evenings, they dined together in the great hall, speaking not of war but of Scripture. Louis quoted the saints. Blanche countered with the wisdom of rulers. Where he sought holiness, she sought survival. Each saw in the other a reflection, one of heaven, one of earth. Neither was wrong. Both were bound by destiny. That summer, she called the court to Reims for a solemn purpose. The coronation of the young king would proceed not as pageantry, but as proof. France would see its sovereign and see the hand that guided him. The cathedral shimmered with banners and incense. When Louis knelt before the altar, the archbishop anointed him with sacred oil. Blanche stood behind him, veiled in white, her gaze steady, unflinching. Every noble in attendance knew the crown might rest upon the boy's head, but the power still lay in his mother's hands. As the final hymn rose, Blanche closed her eyes. The kingdom had survived its darkest hour, but in her heart she felt a chill, the forewarning of storms yet to come. For every crown carries its shadow, and hers was only growing longer. The year after the coronation, the air in Paris turned colder, not from the season, but from suspicion. In the candlelit chambers of the Louvre, where kings once held banquets, whispers now slithered between tapestries and corridors. The regent's rule had brought peace. Yes, but peace is never without its enemies. The barons who had bent the knee began to conspire anew. Letters crossed the channel under night, sealed with red wax and treachery. England's king, Henry III, restless and vain, saw in the young Louis a chance to fracture France before it could rise. He sent gold to her rebels, promises to her nobles, and flattery to her enemies. Blanche of Castile read the signs long before any spy brought word. A silence at court here, a hesitant bow there. She knew the rhythm of deceit. The same men who once swore loyalty now plotted to test the patience of a queen. She gathered her council at dawn. The great hall flickered with torchlight, the scent of incense heavy in the cold. No courtiers, no flatterers, only generals, bishops, and her son. Louis sat beside her, his face still youthful, but his eyes learning the weight of command. France, she said, is not ruled by fear, but she will not be ruled by faithlessness either. Her words were not shouted. They were carved in air, measured, deliberate, final. She ordered the southern garrison strengthened, alliances reaffirmed, the treasury sealed. The crown's gold would flow where loyalty flowed, and stop where doubt began. In her presence, no one dared to argue. Only when she left the chamber did they exhale. Outside the palace, life went on, merchants shouting, monks chanting, the bells of Notre Dame tolling their hours. But within the walls of power, Blanche built an invisible empire. Her spies were monks, her messengers priests, her envoys women who carried letters hidden in rosaries. Where kings sent armies, Blanche sent words, and her words conquered. When Henry's envoys demanded negotiations, she agreed, but on her terms. They met not in Paris, but at the border fortress of Vendôme. There, surrounded by banners of blue and silver, Blanche faced the English delegates. They expected humility from a widow. What they found was majesty. "Tell your king," she said, "that France is not a carcass to be divided, but a crown blessed by God, and God does not yield to gold." The envoys bowed not in reverence, but in recognition. They returned to England with nothing but fear disguised as respect. Yet power, once tested, must be renewed. Blanche knew the nobles would not forgive her strength. So she turned to faith not as escape, but as weapon. She invited the church deeper into the heart of her reign. Cathedrals flourished under her patronage. The Abbey of Maubuisson rose from the fields like a prayer in stone, a monument not to grief, but to endurance. Every arch and tower bore her imprint: restraint, discipline, grace. The people adored her. To the poor, she was justice. To the pious, sanctity. But to the powerful, she was a reminder that the crown could think, and worse, that it could feel. She often walked the cloisters alone at dusk, her steps echoing between columns. Monks would later say she spoke to no one, yet carried the air of command even in silence. Those who met her eyes saw something beyond rank, an unshakable certainty that her rule was not chance, but providence. Then came betrayal. It began in the South Toulouse, where old loyalties to England still lingered like smoke after fire. A count, once forgiven, rose again in rebellion. His banners bore the Lion of Anjou, his letters the seal of Henry's men. The revolt spread like a fever. France trembled, The court panicked, and Blanche, once more, stood alone. She called her knights to arms. This time, even her son would ride. Louis pleaded for command. She refused. "You will not fight for the crown," she said, "until you understand what it costs." He obeyed, though anger shadowed his gaze. The young king watched his mother marshal armies, negotiate with bishops, and confront barons twice her size, never faltering, never yielding. At Tours, she addressed her captains before battle. The sky was gray, the banners snapping in the wind. She raised her hands slender, unarmored, and the men fell silent. "Do not fight for glory," she told them. "Fight for the kingdom that gives your children bread, for the faith that binds your souls, for the peace your queen will guard even when you cannot." They rode out with renewed fervor. And when the fighting ended, the rebellion broke. The southern lords surrendered not to soldiers, but to the reputation of a woman who ruled through reverence. Victory brought stability, but also solitude. Power isolates even as it protects. At night, Blanche walked through the quiet halls of the palace, her footsteps echoing over marble, once filled with laughter. Her husband's portrait watched her from the wall, the Crusader king, frozen in eternal youth. Sometimes she paused before it, candle in hand, and whispered, "You left me a crown, Louis, and with it, a kingdom of men." Then she would turn away, extinguish the flame, and continue alone. Her son grew restless. Louis, now nearly of age, hungered to prove himself. He sought counsel from abbots, from knights, even from Rome itself. But every road led back to her. Blanche was not blind to it. She saw the strength she had planted in him taking root, fierce, righteous, dangerous. It was both her triumph and her curse. One evening, as twilight fell over the Seine, she found him in the chapel. He knelt before the altar, lips moving in fervent prayer. When he rose, their eyes met mother and son, queen and king. No words were spoken. None were needed. She understood, then, that her rule had entered its twilight. He would soon take what was rightfully his, and she, who had ruled men, would have to learn to yield to one. But before she could step aside, fate demanded one more act of defiance. England gathered its armies again, not in open war, but in shadow. Blanche learned of it through a monk in Canterbury, whose trembling hands delivered a message sealed in wax and fear. Henry would strike at Normandy. She moved before dawn. Messengers flew to the castles along the Seine. Walls were manned, supplies secured, alliances renewed. When Henry's ships reached the coast, they found France ready not for battle, but for endurance. The invasion failed before it began. Not a sword raised, not a drop of blood spilled, only strategy, faith, and the legend of a queen who could not be deceived. When word of the English retreat reached Paris, Blanche allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She walked to the palace balcony overlooking the city. Below, the people gathered, chanting her name. From the towers of Notre Dame, the bells rang not for death, but for deliverance. For the first time since her husband's passing, she smiled, not in pride, but in gratitude to God, to France, to the silence that had been her companion through every trial. Her grief became her armor, the people said, her faith, her sword. And so the widow ruled not for herself, but for the kingdom that had learned to survive by her will alone. The winter after England's retreat was the harshest in years. Snow drifted over the rooftops of Paris, coating the gargoyles of Notre Dame in white silence. The Seine froze at its edges, and the bells carried farther than the human voice. Yet inside the halls of the Palais de la Cité, the queen did not rest. Blanche of Castile ruled not as regent now, but as architect. Every edict, every alliance, every coin minted bore her mark. The boy king was nearing his majority, but the kingdom, the fragile, breathing organism of France, still lived by her will. Each morning, before the first candle was lit, she prayed in the royal chapel, not for power nor victory, but clarity. To see the lines others missed, the shift in loyalty behind a smile, the ambition hidden in courtesy. Then, while the rest of the court still slept, she began the business of a kingdom. Her counselors feared her discipline as much as her faith. The Bishop of Paris once wrote, "The Queen's virtue is not gentle. It is sharp as iron." For Blanche knew what her enemies did not. Peace was not the absence of war, it was the mastery of it. Beyond the palace, the world trembled again. In the south, old heresies smoldered, the remnants of the Albigensian crusade. Fanatics who preached against the church, claiming that the material world was evil. In the north, barons whispered of England's aid, still dreaming of autonomy. And across the sea, the Pope himself weighed France's devotion like a merchant with gold. Blanche stood at the center of this storm, her hands steady. She summoned her lords to Paris not with threats, but with faith. The invitation bore no seal of command, only her signature and a single phrase, "Come and remember to whom you swore." They came from Burgundy, Champagne, Anjou, hard men with harder eyes, who knelt in the cathedral not before her, but before the symbol she carried, the cross. It was in this gathering that Louis, now 17, first appeared as more than a son, tall, solemn, with the faint shadow of a beard and the fire of conviction in his gaze. He wore no crown yet, but there was already something royal in his stillness. Blanche watched him from afar, pride and apprehension mingling in her chest. She saw her husband's gentleness in him and her own resolve. But she also saw the dangerous spark of zeal, the kind that burns too brightly, consuming what it touches. When the assembly ended, she called him privately. The chamber was lit by the low flame of a single candelabrum. "You speak well," she told him, "but words are embers. You must learn when to let them burn and when to let them die." "I only speak for God and France," he replied. She smiled, faintly. "Then pray that God and France never disagree." He bowed, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. That night she could not sleep. Outside, snow fell like ash. She stood by the window, watching the torches of the city flicker in the dark. The Regency, she knew, was nearing its end. But France, her France, was not yet ready to be left alone. The boy she had raised to be king still thought faith alone could rule men. He had not yet learned the cruelty of loyalty, the price of peace. And so, though the laws of the realm demanded she yield the reins, she held them tighter. Not from ambition, but from fear, the fear only a mother knows. Spring came, and with it, war. In the south, Raymond of Toulouse rose again, his defiance emboldened by foreign gold and whispers of English blessing. The crown's banners unfurled once more, not under a king, but under a queen. Blanche sent her captains to the field, her letters to Rome, and her prayers to heaven. Louis begged to ride. "Let me serve France," he said. "Let me prove what you have taught me." She hesitated. She saw not the eager youth before her, but the child she had once held as Paris burned with rebellion. Still, she knew this moment could not be delayed forever. "Very well," she said, "but you will not command. You will observe." He agreed and departed at dawn, his cloak whipping behind him like a flame in the wind. The city watched him go, cheering the name of their young king. And Blanche, standing at the gates, whispered a prayer not for his victory, but for his wisdom. Weeks passed. News came in, fragments, skirmishes won, villages burned, treaties broken. The rebellion spread faster than expected. Yet, even as chaos rose, Blanche did not waver. Her council urged retreat or negotiation. She refused both. "A kingdom that bargains with disobedience invites its own ruin," she said. Instead, she devised a strategy no man at her table dared to suggest, one of patience. While her armies held the south in check, she struck elsewhere, the purse. She froze the lands of disloyal nobles, seized the tithes of rebellious abbeys, and cut off trade routes to England's sympathizers. Her enemies had swords. She had hunger, and hunger, she knew, conquered faster than steel. Within months, the revolt collapsed under its own starvation. The southern lords sued for peace. Blanche granted it, but only after they came barefoot to her presence, their seals broken, their heads bowed. France was hers again. Louis returned from the campaign hardened, silent, his armor still bearing the stains of war. When he entered the palace, the court fell to their knees. He walked past them without a word, straight to his mother's chamber. There, before the queen, he bowed deeply. "You were right," he said. "War does not make kings. Faith does." Blanche studied him, her heart aching with pride and apprehension. "No," she whispered. "Faith makes saints. But kings must live among sinners." He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something that frightened her. Conviction without mercy. A mirror of her own resolve, stripped of gentleness. In the months that followed, France entered an uneasy peace. But the line between queen and son grew thinner. Louis began holding councils of his own, issuing judgments, dispensing favors. The nobles, ever pragmatic, started turning their bows toward him. Blanche did not resist. She had prepared for this, yet the quiet shift of power felt like a wound reopened. Still, she guided him subtly, like a hand steering the helm from behind the curtain. When he faltered, she advised. When he hesitated, she commanded. France, though ruled by a king, still bore the will of its queen. Then, one summer morning, a messenger arrived from Rome. The Pope himself had written a call for reconciliation with England, a truce blessed in the name of Christ. It was an opportunity for peace, but also a test. Louis wished to accept immediately. Blanche hesitated. She knew England's word was a snake's promise. "Do not mistake the cross for a chain," she told her son. "Sometimes peace is the costlier war." He looked at her long, then turned away. And in that moment, she understood. Her pupil had become his own master. That night, Blanche walked once more through the gardens of the palace. The moon shone over the fountains, the lilies pale as ghosts. She remembered her youth in Castile, her mother's words echoing still. "Faith is armor, but it must not become your cage." She smiled faintly. For all her victories, all her prayers, she had forged not only a king, but a destiny that would soon outgrow her. And yet, even as power began to slip from her grasp, she felt no regret, only the strange, solemn peace of fulfillment. For the queen who had ruled through storms and rebellions had won her truest battle. She had taught France how to stand without her. The air in Paris shifted. It was no longer the heavy stillness of conquest, but the uneasy calm that follows a storm. France stood intact, but power, like water, had begun to change its course, and Blanche of Castile felt the tide receding from her hands. Louis IX had ascended to more than ceremony. He was no longer the boy she guarded, nor the pupil she molded. He had become something else, radiant, unyielding, and dangerously devout. In council, he spoke little but decided swiftly. When he prayed, it was not in quiet humility, but in rapture. He fasted, gave away his own food to beggars, and demanded purity in a world made of compromise. His people loved him for it. The nobles, weary of the queen's iron piety, found in her son a gentler tyrant, one who judged not through politics, but through conscience. Blanche watched it unfold from her chamber, day by day. Every sermon that praised his holiness cut deeper than any dagger. She had raised a saint, and saints, she now understood, do not share their altars. The first crack appeared in the council. A minor dispute over taxation and abbot's land exempted from royal dues. Louis sided with the church. Blanche sided with the crown. "The kingdom bleeds silver," she told him. "Even holiness must pay its tithe. And if God himself asked it of us?" Louis replied. The room fell silent. She saw the glimmer in his eyes, the same unbending flame she once called strength. Now it looked like defiance. That evening, as bells tolled over the city, Blanche stood alone in the chapel, her hands clasped around the crucifix, her voice barely a whisper. "Lord, teach me to let him rule, for I have ruled too long." But no voice answered, only the echo of her own plea, dissolving in the vaulted dark. Summer burned through France like incense smoke. Pilgrims flooded Paris to see the relics. Louis had brought forth fragments of the true cross, thorns of Christ's crown. He walked barefoot through the streets in penance, while the people wept and praised his sanctity. Blanche followed him, veiled, unrecognized. She watched the faces of her subjects, faces that once turned to her for salvation, now turned to him for grace. A strange ache filled her chest, neither pride nor envy, but something older, loss. For every cheer for her son was a farewell to herself. When she returned to the palace, the courtiers bowed lower than usual, out of reverence, yes, but also pity. They saw what she would not yet say aloud. France no longer had one ruler, but two. Then came the summons from Poitiers. A southern baron, emboldened by whispers of weakness, refused the king's decree. Louis wished to send an envoy. Blanche ordered an army. "Mercy is not weakness," he told her. "And neither is justice," she replied. But this time, he did not yield. The royal banner left Paris without her. For the first time since she had taken the throne, the armies of France rode to war under another's command. Weeks passed with no word. Blanche filled the silence with prayer and letters, messages to bishops, abbots, lords, reminding them that France still watched through her eyes. She waited in the same palace where she had once ruled entire wars by ink and will alone. And she discovered that waiting, not rebellion, not battle, was the cruelest test of power. When word finally came, it was victory. The baron had submitted, his fortress open to the king. Louis had negotiated peace, not demanded it. No blood spilled, no cities burned. France rejoiced. Blanche read the letter twice before setting it down. Her heart swelled with pride and a shadow of dread. For though her son had won, he had done so without her methods, without her mind. He had ruled in his own way and succeeded. That night, she knelt once more before the crucifix, whispering through tears, "If this is my reward, Lord, let it be enough." But peace is a fragile crown. Not all hearts were content beneath it. Within the court, ambition stirred again, not among the barons, but among the churchmen. They saw in Louis a holy monarch they could mold, a king whose conscience might be guided by their hand. And where the clergy courted influence, the nobles smelled opportunity. Rumors began soft, venomous. That Blanche was a relic of the old age, too proud, too cold, too foreign. That her piety was hypocrisy, her rule tyranny. That France needed no mother now, only a son. It was not rebellion this time. It was erosion, slow, polite, inevitable. One morning, a monk came to her chambers with a letter from the king. Louis was summoning her to join him in Poitiers, to witness the signing of new decrees, laws that would reshape the crown's relation to the church. She knew what it meant. The balance was tipping at last. She went. The journey south was long, quiet. The roads she had once secured through war were now lined with pilgrims and peace. When she arrived, the court greeted her with reverence and distance. Louis stood at the center, robed not as a monarch, but as a servant of God. Before him lay the decrees. They granted the church privileges she would never have allowed, lands untaxed, judgments exempt from royal court. He smiled as he handed her the quill. "You taught me to honor God above all," he said. "Now let us do so together." Her hand trembled. She looked at him, her son, her creation, her successor, and saw not defiance, but faith so absolute it no longer knew fear. She signed. That night, she sat in the garden of the fortress. The stars were faint, the air thick with summer heat. Her thoughts drifted to Castile, her mother, her youth, her lessons. Faith is armor, her mother had said. But armor, when worn too long, becomes a prison. For the first time, Blanche understood. She had forged France through piety and will, through discipline and prayer. But the same iron that had saved her kingdom had also caged her in it. Louis would go on to rule as a saint, to wage wars not for land, but for heaven. And Blanche, the mother who had made him, would fade into the quiet where saints are born, and queens are forgotten. Yet she felt no bitterness. Her work was complete. Her France would live, and in its heart, the echo of her resolve would never die. As dawn broke, Blanche rose and returned to her chamber. Her crown rested upon the table, untouched, gleaming faintly in the light. She smiled at it not as a symbol of loss, but of legacy. Then, she placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "The silver throne remains," for it had never been the seat she guarded, but the spirit she left behind, a kingdom ruled not by the strength of men, but by the conscience of one woman. The bells of Paris rang differently now. Once they tolled for victory and vengeance, the pulse of a kingdom ruled by iron. Now they sang hymns of peace. The sword had been sheathed, and prayer had become the new crown. France was changing, and so was its king. Louis IX walked the corridors of his palace like a monk in borrowed robes. He ate from clay bowls while silver gathered dust in the treasury. He bathed the feet of beggars, called them brothers, and spent his mornings not in council, but in confession. Where once Blanche of Castile ruled by strategy, her son ruled by sacrifice. It was said that under his reign, the angels themselves might envy France. But the angels did not collect taxes, nor feed soldiers, nor quell famine. Holiness, it seemed, could not mend every broken beam of the state. Blanche knew this. She had known it her entire life. And as she watched her son give away half the treasury to churches and pilgrims, she felt again that restless fire, the same that had driven her through sieges and betrayals. "Piety will not keep the walls standing," she whispered one night to her old advisor, Pierre Mauclair. "No, my lady," he replied, "but it keeps the people kneeling." She frowned, because for all her son's sanctity, Blanche feared what kneeling too long could cost. A nation built on prayer could still starve. The nobles saw the same weakness. They smiled in their halls and whispered over their wine. "The boy king means well," they said, "but he forgets what keeps a crown upon a head." In Aquitaine, taxes went unpaid. In the south, a baron hanged a royal collector in defiance. And though Louis preached mercy, rebellion does not repent. Blanche rode once more from Paris, not as regent, not as queen, but as mother. She traveled in silence, her retinue small, her eyes sharper than ever. Every village she passed bore signs of her son's charity monasteries, fat with gold, while peasants gnawed on crusts. Faith had made him beloved, but love alone could not govern. At last, she arrived at the baron's keep, its towers rising against the sunset like blackened teeth. Her banner, the silver fleur-de-lis, fluttered in the wind. The baron came down to meet her, smiling with the arrogance of a man certain of forgiveness. "Your son is a saint," he said. "He would not hang a man for disobedience." "No," Blanche answered, her voice calm as a drawn blade, "but his mother would." By dawn, the rebellion was ash. No trial, no sermon, no forgiveness, only the quiet restoration of order the way it had always been under her rule. When she returned to Paris, Louis greeted her at the palace steps. He kissed her hand and said softly, "You did what was just, mother." But she heard the weight in his tone, a sorrow, almost pity. He turned away before she could answer. In that moment, she understood. He would never chastise her, never defy her outright. He would only outgrow her gently, completely. Years drifted on like a slow, golden river. France flourished under Louis's peace. Pilgrims filled the roads, trade blossomed, cathedrals soared. The people called him Louis the Just, Louis the Holy, Louis the Mirror of Kings. And in their prayers, Blanche's name faded like a candle in daylight. But the Queen Mother did not resent it. She spent her days tending to the sick, teaching the nuns, writing letters to her sons and daughters across Europe. Power, once her weapon, had become her relic. She polished it only in memory. Sometimes she visited the Sainte-Chapelle, the radiant jewel of Paris, the church Louis had built to house Christ's crown of thorns. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting her face in blues and golds. She would sit alone on the bench and whisper, "You were right, my son. You are the better ruler." But deep down, she also knew holiness could never last untouched. There would come a day when Louis's purity would be tested, when the world would demand of him what faith alone could not give. And when that day came, she prayed he would have enough of her steel left in him to survive it. That day came sooner than she feared. In the spring of his 31st year, Louis fell ill. A fever, swift and violent, took him as he returned from a pilgrimage. The court panicked. The people prayed. Blanche did neither, she commanded. Doctors, monks, priests, all brought to his side. The palace became a shrine of desperation, its corridors echoing with psalms and sobs. For 6 days and nights, she sat beside him, refusing food, refusing rest. Her hand never left his. Once, she thought she felt him slip away and something inside her broke. "Not yet," she murmured. "Not before France is safe." She had buried kings, husbands, and enemies, but never could she bury the child who was her heart. On the 7th day, his fever broke. He awoke pale, trembling but alive. The court rejoiced, calling it a miracle. Louis himself, eyes hollow with revelation, whispered, "God has spared me for his purpose." Blanche, exhausted, only smiled. She knew that look. She had worn it once herself, when the crown first touched her head. A divine mission is a dangerous thing. When he rose from his sickbed, Louis was no longer merely devout, he was consumed. He spoke of cleansing Christendom, of bringing the cross beyond the sea, of crusade. Blanche's heart froze. She had seen the ruin such dreams left behind, kings broken, kingdoms drained. But Louis was resolute. In every sermon, every decree, he invoked God's will as the banner of destiny. And the people followed, because faith, like fire, spreads faster than reason. "Mother," he said one evening, "you taught me to fear God above all. Now I will serve him above all." She took his hand, the same hand she had once guided through ink and parchment, sword and scripture. "Then serve him," she said quietly, "but do not forget the world he gave you." He smiled, and for a moment she saw the boy again, the child who had hidden behind her robes during the siege of Paris. But when he looked away, she knew that child was gone forever. Winter crept upon France. The banners for the crusade were woven, the ships prepared at Aigues-Mortes. Every church bell in Christendom rang with the promise of holy war. Blanche stood on the steps of the cathedral, watching her son kneel before the altar. He wore no crown, only a pilgrim's robe. And when he rose, she saw it, the light in his eyes that no mother could dim, no queen could command. It was faith made flesh. She turned to her attendants, voice steady as stone. "If he leaves," she said, "I must rule again, for France will not pray its way through war." And thus, as her son prepared to march for God, Blanche of Castile prepared once more to govern in his shadow, the mother of a saint, the ruler of men, and the last guardian of a fragile peace. The morning of his departure came cloaked in mist. From the port at Aigues-Mortes, the sea stretched out like a pale mirror, endless, holy, and merciless. Thousands gathered along the shore, faces lifted toward the horizon, where a forest of masts waited like spears pointed toward heaven. Blanche stood among them, veiled in silver. She had been queen long enough to know the ocean's hunger, how it took men and never returned them the same. Her heart swelled with pride, fear, and something older than both, the knowledge that every act of faith demands a sacrifice. Louis knelt before her. He looked thin from fasting, pale from nights of prayer, but his eyes were steady. In them burned the same fire that had once driven her through rebellion and grief. Only his burned for God, not for France. "Pray for me, mother," he said. "I always have," she whispered. He pressed her hand to his forehead. Then he rose, turned, and walked toward the ships. Not once did he look back. Blanche did not cry. Queens do not weep before their people. But as the sails caught wind and the fleet began to fade into the gray horizon, she whispered a single word to the waves. return. Paris mourned and celebrated all at once. Crusade fever gripped the kingdom, banners raised, songs sung, relics paraded through the streets. But beneath the hymns and processions, Blanche heard the rustle of unease. War drained coffers faster than it saved souls. The merchants complained of empty ports. The peasants feared the coming winter. And the nobles, those wolves forever waiting, began to sniff the air again. But Blanche was ready. At 63, she ruled with a mind sharper than any blade. She summoned councils, balanced tithes, and punished dissent with the quiet precision of habit. Her will filled every hall, her presence every whisper. "The king may fight for heaven," one chronicler wrote, "but his mother defends the earth beneath his feet. Yet Eva still rusts." The years weighed upon her like frost upon a branch. Her hands trembled as she signed decrees. The fire in her voice waned to embers. Still, she ruled. Because ruling was not her choice, it was her penance. In her private hours, she walked the gardens of the abbey at Maubuisson, her favorite refuge. There, among white lilies and stone angels, she spoke to God not as a queen, but as a mother. "You gave me a son who serves you," she murmured, eyes on the horizon. "But you left me to bear the cost." She would not live to see his victories or his failures, but she could ensure that, when he returned, France would still stand whole, prosperous, and waiting. Months turned to years. From the east came letters, long scrolls written in Louis's delicate hand. He spoke of Egypt, of the heat, the dust, the endless Sunday. He spoke of prisoners and converts, of famine and fever, and through every word pulsed his unwavering faith. Blanche read each letter by candlelight, alone in her chamber. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes her lips moved in silent prayer. But more often, she stared at the ink and felt the cold hand of fear. For every line of devotion, she could read the shadow of danger behind it. She had lived too long to mistake faith for fortune. One evening, the courier brought not a letter, but a silence. The court froze as rumors spread the crusade had faltered. The king taken captive in the Nile sands. Blanche demanded confirmation. Messengers rode through rain and night, and at last the truth arrived. Louis was alive, but in prison. The ransom demanded was vast more than France could bear without breaking. The court panicked. Advisors pleaded to raise taxes, to debase the coin, to seize church treasure. But Blanche refused every counsel born of desperation. "France does not ransom her soul," she said, "only her king." And so she set about gathering what was needed not through tyranny, but through will. Gold flowed from cathedrals, abbeys, estates. Even peasants brought coins, jewels, heirlooms, for in their eyes, the king's holiness had become France's own. When the ransom was sent, and word returned that Louis was free, Blanche allowed herself one sigh of relief. Then she ordered another decree. "The kingdom shall not celebrate until he stands again upon its soil," because she knew joy too early invites tragedy. But tragedy, faithful as the tide, was already coming for her. That winter, the air grew heavy and cold. She fell ill in the abbey at Maubuisson, the same sanctuary she had built with her own hands decades before. The physicians begged her to rest, but she refused. Even as fever burned through her, she dictated letters to her son, to her council, to the church. Every line ended the same: "For the safety of France, for the will of God." When at last her strength failed, she asked to be moved to the chapel. There, beneath the vault she had raised, she lay upon a simple cot, her fingers tracing the beads of her rosary. The sisters knelt around her. She lifted her gaze toward the crucifix. Her lips moved in prayer not for herself, but for him, for the boy who had become a saint, for the man she had made into a king. "Keep him," she whispered, "for I can no longer do so." Her last breath came as gently as her first command, silent, absolute, and final. When the news reached the Holy Land, Louis fell to his knees. The chroniclers say he wept for 3 days and spoke no word. Then he rose, walked to the nearest church, and prayed until dawn. In that stillness, he understood what the world had lost. His mother had been more than queen or regent. She had been the spine of his kingdom, the breath that held it upright. Without her, he would rule, but never again would he be ruled. In Paris, the people mourned not as subjects, but as children. They lined the roads for her procession, thousands upon thousands, carrying candles through the mist. Her coffin was draped in silver cloth, the emblem of the fleur-de-lis stitched in white thread. As it passed beneath the towers of Notre Dame, the bells tolled low and slow, echoing across the Seine. She was the mother of France, a monk wrote, and now France itself is orphaned. They laid her to rest in Maubuisson, the abbey she loved, beside the altar she had built. Above her tomb they carved only 2 words, Mater Regis, the king's mother. But history would remember more. For in the centuries to come, when France spoke of its saints and sovereigns, her name would whisper between them the quiet power that bound them all. And thus ended the reign of Blanche of Castile, the woman who ruled without a crown, who forged a saint from flesh and faith, and whose will shaped the destiny of a kingdom. Her story did not die with her. It lingered in the stone of cathedrals, in the prayers of widows, in the conscience of kings who came after. She ruled no army, one chronicler wrote, but all men marched in the shadow of her will, and in that shadow the light of France endured. The bells of Paris had not yet gone silent when the king returned. Louis came home not in triumph, but in ashes, his armor rusted, his banners torn, his face carved by sand and sorrow. Behind him trailed the remnants of a crusade that had bled out in the desert, their silence heavier than any hymn. He dismounted before Notre Dame, barefoot, his crown carried in his hands rather than on his head. The city watched in awe. To them, he was not a conqueror, he was a penitent, a man walking in the shadow of a mother he could never surpass. Inside the cathedral, incense filled the air. Louis knelt where Blanche once stood. Her memory still lingered in the stones, her voice in the echoes, her prayers in the flicker of every candle. "You ruled for God," he whispered. "Now teach me to rule for men." Outside, the city breathed again. France had lost its queen, but her faith had left a spine in the kingdom that even defeat could not break. The regency was over. Louis was now both king and conscience, and he ruled with a devotion that bordered on divine madness. He rebuilt the treasury Blanche had emptied to ransom him. He restored churches, fed the poor, and washed the feet of lepers with his own hands. The court whispered that he had become too holy for his own good. But Louis cared little for courts. He saw in every act of mercy the echo of his mother's gaze, that quiet command that had once bent kings and barons alike. At dusk, he would walk the cloisters of the palace gardens, where Blanche's voice still seemed to linger in the wind. Strength is not to be seen, it is to be endured. He lived by those words, and through them, France began to change. In the great hall of the Palais de la Cité, sunlight fell through tall jeweled windows, his mother's gift to Paris. The glass told stories of saints and martyrs, but among them, Louis saw another truth, his own reflection, dwarfed by light. He rose from his throne and addressed his council. "We have fought for God in the sands," he said. "Now we must serve him in our own soil." No man dared contradict him, for even the proudest noble had seen how the people adored him not as ruler, but as shepherd. Where Blanche had ruled through strength of will, Louis ruled through purity of purpose. He outlawed private war between nobles, reformed the courts, and placed justice above vengeance. "Better a guilty man go free," he declared, "than an innocent one perish by a king's hand." The words shocked them. No monarch had ever spoken such heresy against power. But Louis's faith was not in kingship, it was in the kingdom his mother had shaped. Still, peace was never a crown easily worn. Even holiness draws envy. In the north, the English king tested his borders. In the south, heresy smoldered in secret towns. And within France, old families muttered that the king had become too meek, too merciful, that the throne of iron had turned to silver once more. Louis heard the whispers and smiled. He saw in their scorn the proof that his mother's lessons had taken root. "Let them say I am weak," he told his confessor. "If weakness builds what strength destroys, then let me be weak forever." But he could not resist the call that had haunted him since childhood, the call of the cross. It burned in him as fiercely as it once burned in Blanche's prayers. For she had forged not only a saint, but a crusader who could not rest while the Holy Land bled. Night after night, he prayed before her tomb at Maubuisson. He spoke to her as he once did as a boy, asking counsel, seeking courage. The air around him seemed to shimmer with memory. Perhaps it was only candlelight, or perhaps the spirit of the queen still listened. "Mother," he murmured, "you taught me to rule through faith. Now faith commands me to leave all you built behind." He rose from the marble floor and made his decision. France would march again under the cross. The council begged him to reconsider. They spoke of empty coffers, of wounds not yet healed, but Louis's gaze was distant, his will untouchable. He no longer sought victory. He sought redemption. And so, as Blanche once had done, he prepared to give himself to a cause larger than crown or flesh. When spring came, the streets of Paris bloomed with banners once more. Knights gathered, pilgrims sang, priests blessed the steel that would soon darken with blood. But among the crowd stood old men who had seen the last crusade, and they bowed their heads in silence. They remembered the queen who had once ruled from prayer, who had held the kingdom steady while her son fought in distant lands. Now she was gone, and her son followed her path into sacrifice, into uncertainty, into legend. Before his departure, Louis returned to Maubuisson one final time. The abbey was quiet, wrapped in dawn. He knelt before her tomb, his fingers tracing the carved words, Mater Regis. "You gave me everything," he whispered. "Now I give you back what you made." He placed his crown upon the stone. For a moment, the morning light touched the silver filigree, and it seemed to burn like faith made visible. Then he rose, leaving the crown behind. It would be carried after him, not upon his head, but as a relic, the symbol of a kingship that no longer sought glory, only grace. When the fleet sailed once more, France watched in silence. The sea, that old thief, stretched open its arms again. Louis stood at the bow of his ship, the wind lifting his hair, his face calm, his eyes fixed toward the rising Sunday. Behind him lay the kingdom his mother had built, stable, righteous, unbroken. Ahead lay the unknown. But in that space between earth and heaven, between legacy and destiny, there was only the echo of her voice. "Rule not for the living, my son, but for the soul of the world." And so he went a king, chasing the memory of a queen, a son still living beneath the light of the silver throne. The ships left the French coast like a procession of ghosts. Each sail gleamed white against the gray horizon, crosses painted in crimson, banners snapping in the sea wind. Louis stood at the prow, unmoving, eyes fixed eastward. Behind him, the fleet stretched into the mist nights. Monks, healers, peasants, and sons of France who had followed a king who had never promised victory, only salvation. The voyage was long and cruel. Storms broke across the decks like judgment. Men prayed and cursed in equal measure. Yet Louis, untouched by fear, knelt at dawn and dusk, murmuring prayers that seemed to quiet even the sea. He ate little, slept less, and spent his nights beneath the open sky, gazing at stars that once guided prophets. To the soldiers, he was not merely their sovereign, he was their anchor. And in every whispered prayer, in every weary glance toward the east, they saw the faint reflection of his mother's faith. "He carries the queen's light with him," they said. "Even the sea dares not extinguish it." When they reached Egypt, the heat struck like a living beast. The air shimmered above the dunes, the Nile crawled thick with silt and secrets. Louis ordered his men to disembark. He did not shout, did not gesture grandly, he simply looked toward the horizon, and they followed. The crusade began not with the trumpet of glory, but with the groan of burden. Supplies rotted, men fell sick, The sun punished armor and flesh alike. Still, Louis marched at the front, carrying no sword but a staff carved with a cross. Each day he prayed for his enemies before battle. Each night he buried his dead with his own hands. When the French took Damietta, the victory felt hollow. The city's gold could not cool the fever that soon crept through the camp. The Nile, generous with disease, became a graveyard. And in that fevered darkness, the line between faith and folly began to blur. Louis grew thinner, paler, but his resolve did not waver. He tended the sick, refused comfort, and spoke of God's will as if it were a fire he could still see in the distance. But even divine conviction has limits when surrounded by death. One evening, as he stood by the river, a wind rose from the south carrying sand and the stench of decay. He closed his eyes, and for the briefest instant, he imagined his mother beside him. Her voice, calm and unyielding, seemed to whisper through the storm, "Do not mistake God's silence for absence." He opened his eyes and crossed himself. The next day, he led his men deeper into the heart of Egypt. The disaster came swiftly. A counterattack struck from the marshes, and the Nile flooded, trapping the Crusaders between water and blade. The French banners sank into mud. Knights drowned in their armor. The air filled with cries of agony, of disbelief, of prayers unanswered. Louis refused to flee. He fought not with sword but with courage, standing amid the chaos, urging his men to hold their lines even as they fell one by one. When he was finally captured, it was not as a broken man, but as a martyr of his own conviction. In chains, he knelt, and as his captors mocked him, he whispered the only words that mattered, "Fiat voluntas Dei, thy will be done." The Sultan of Egypt, astonished by the king's serenity, treated him not as prisoner but as guest. Ransom was demanded, gold that France could barely gather. Yet even in captivity Louis governed. He mediated disputes among the Crusaders, comforted the wounded, prayed for his captors' souls. He refused wine, refused despair. The soldiers began to call him the King of Patience. And when at last his ransom was paid and he was released, he did not sail home. He stayed. For 4 years, Louis remained in the Holy Land, rebuilding fortresses, tending to pilgrims, writing letters to France that spoke not of defeat, but of duty. Each word carried the quiet authority of his mother's ghost. "A throne is not a seat of rest," he wrote, "but an altar of sacrifice." When he finally returned to France, his beard had gone white, his body frail, his steps slow, but his gaze, that steady, burning gaze, was unchanged. Paris received him as it had once received Blanche, with reverence touched by awe. The bells tolled, the people wept, and in the crowds, old women whispered prayers of thanks. For though he had failed in war, he had triumphed in spirit. Louis rebuilt what the crusade had broken. He founded hospitals, fed the poor, forgave debts, and strengthened the laws that bore his mother's imprint. Justice became ritual. Mercy became policy. France, though scarred, grew serene, as if the soul of the queen still ruled through her son's hand. Years passed. The court changed, the nobles aged, but Louis remained unyielding in his piety. He rose before dawn to pray and dined with monks rather than courtiers. When foreign emissaries arrived, expecting to find a weary monarch, they instead met a man whose faith had become his crown. And yet, beneath the calm, a restless fire smoldered. The Holy Land was not free. The cross still bled, and Louis, now gray and gentle, could not ignore its call. His advisors pleaded with him. France was at peace. His sons were grown. His legacy was secure. But Louis shook his head. "What is peace," he said, "if it is not given to God?" He would go once more, not as conqueror but as pilgrim. He would finish the crusade his soul had never left. In the spring of his final journey, he passed again through the Abbey of Malbuisson. The same light fell through the same windows, soft upon the marble of his mother's tomb. He knelt, as he had always done, his fingers resting on the cold stone. "I have followed your path," he said softly. Now I come to its end. He rose and turned toward the door. The abbess, watching from the shadows, thought she saw two figures, walking one old, one unseen, side by side, into the Sunday. As the fleet sailed south again, no songs accompanied it. There was no glory left to chase, no audience to impress. Only a king, his cross, and the ghost of a queen whose lessons had outlived her crown. And far behind them, in the quiet heart of France, her silver throne remained empty but radiant. A reminder that power could be forged not by conquest, but by conviction. Louis's ship vanished beyond the horizon. History would call him Saint Louis, but long before sainthood, he had been something greater, the living echo of Blanche of Castile's unbreakable will. And so, even as his sails disappeared into the blue, her light endured. The silver throne still shone untarnished, eternal. The bells of Paris tolled low and mournful, though no death had yet been declared. Their sound rolled through the gray streets like an omen, echoing against the stone that she had once made holy. In the palace at Maubuisson, where the air smelled faintly of wax and lavender, the queen who had ruled France through faith lay in silence. Blanche of Castile was no longer the woman who once defied kingdoms. Her hair had turned white, her hands thin as parchment, but in her stillness there remained the same command, the same serenity that had silenced armies and bent nobles to her will. Even age bowed before her. The candles burned steadily at her bedside. Beside her chair lay the letters, hundreds of them written in her son's narrow, disciplined hand, each sealed with the cross of France, each filled with words of devotion, faith, and war. They were her most sacred relics. Outside, winter gathered like judgment. The forests stood bare. The sky, pale as bone. Messengers came and went through the palace gates, their breath clouding in the cold. News traveled slowly, but all of France seemed to breathe the same anxious prayer. The queen still lives. Blanche no longer attended council. She no longer commanded, no longer corrected. Yet her presence governed, still her name invoked in every edict, her shadow felt in every church and courtyard. She was not ruler now, but relic, not voice, but legend. She spent her hours in the chapel, alone. The marble floor chilled her feet. The stone walls whispered her prayers back to her. She no longer asked for victory, only endurance. For Louis, far away in Africa once more, had taken the cross again. The son she had molded into sainthood now walked the path that would claim him. Each morning, she received a letter. They arrived sealed with dust, from lands she would never see, Acre, Tunis, Carthage. The script remained steady at first, firm as conviction. But as the months passed, the ink began to tremble. The lines faltered. The sentences grew shorter. Louis's words spoke of faith and hardship, of heat and hunger, of soldiers dying with hymns on their lips. He wrote of the poor he fed, of the mosques he turned into sanctuaries, of the quiet hope that the Lord still watched. But between the lines and the pauses, in the ink that sometimes smudged, she read the truth. Her son was fading. The saint was dying. She pressed one of his letters to her lips and whispered the prayer she had whispered since his birth. Let my strength be his shield. Let my will be his light. And then she folded the letter and placed it with the rest, a kingdom of paper and faith built on longing. In her final winter, Blanche walked the halls of Maubuisson with a slow, deliberate grace. Servants stepped aside, bowing not out of duty but reverence. Even the abbess trembled slightly when the queen entered the chapel, as if God himself had risen to attention. The nuns whispered stories about her. They said she spoke to angels at night, that her prayers could calm storms, heal fever, bring sleep to the restless. They did not know that what they mistook for miracles was merely the echo of a mother's love stretched across an ocean. Sometimes she would stand before the window overlooking the cloister gardens. Snow fell on the statues of saints and martyrs, dusting them in fragile purity. She would gaze at them for long moments, her breath a faint mist in the cold air. And in that silence, she seemed to see both past and future, a little boy learning his prayers beside her knee, a king kneeling before an altar in Jerusalem, a cross rising above the sea. She would close her eyes then and whisper, "He was never mine to keep, only mine to guide." France itself seemed to sense her fading. In Paris, the churches stayed full. Merchants lit candles for her health. Peasants whispered her name in their evening prayers. She had become more than queen, she was France's conscience. A symbol of what ruled when kings were away and chaos dared approach. Her counselors came to see her one last time. They found her seated in a high-backed chair, wrapped in a mantle of white. Her hands rested calmly upon her lap, her rosary glinting faintly in the dim light. They expected frailty. What they found instead was peace. She spoke of governance, of the laws she had written with care, of the faith that had bound a kingdom together when swords could not. Then she smiled faintly, as one who sees the far side of victory, and dismissed them with a gesture. There was nothing left to rule but her own heart. That night, a storm swept through the valley. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolled like drums of war. The abbess found Blanche kneeling before the altar, motionless. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. Her eyes were fixed upon the crucifix, and in their pale light there burned the same quiet fire that had guided her entire life. She prayed not for herself, but for her son, for the king still beneath a foreign sky, for the soldiers who followed him, for the land she would soon leave behind. And when she rose, her legs trembled, but her spirit did not. She returned to her chamber, extinguished the lamp, and sat by the window to watch the storm pass. Lightning split the sky, revealing for an instant the valley below, the abbey she had built, the river she had crossed as a bride, the land she had made whole. It was enough. At dawn, the rain ceased. The clouds broke apart, and sunlight spilled through the glass, painting her room in gold. The attendants found her still by the window, hands clasped, eyes closed, her lips faintly curved as if she were still whispering prayer. The silver throne was empty, but it had not fallen. In that quiet room, with its scent of wax and roses, the woman who had defied kings and made saints surrendered her crown at last, not to death, but to eternity. The abbey bells rang again, this time not in warning, but in reverence. Their sound carried over rivers and cities, through the forests and into the hearts of a people who had never known her face but lived by her legacy. France mourned, and in that mourning, something eternal was born of faith, not in kings or crowns, but in the power of one woman's steadfast grace. The news of her death traveled slower than grief. Riders carried it across fields drenched with winter rain, across rivers swollen with snowmelt, through forests where monks and peasants alike stopped to pray as they passed. No trumpet announced it, no army marched, only the steady beat of hooves, and the whisper of her name, Blanche, the Queen, the Mother of France. In every village the messengers crossed, bells tolled softly. From the monasteries of Burgundy to the cathedrals of Reims, her requiem rose in waves. They said heaven was richer by one soul, and France was poorer by its light. Far from the kingdom she had kept whole, Louis received the news beneath a sun that burned like judgment. He stood upon the sands near Carthage, the white banner of the lilies snapping weakly in the desert wind. The messenger knelt before him, dust clinging to his armor, and placed in his hands the seal he knew by heart, the cross, entwined with silver thread. For a long moment, Louis said nothing. The desert stretched silent around him. The crusading camp hushed, soldiers turning their faces toward the king who had been born of her will. And though no tears fell, his body swayed as if struck not by grief, but by revelation. He withdrew to his tent. There, beneath a single flickering lamp, he broke the seal and read her final words. They were not of farewell. They were instruction. They spoke of mercy, of duty, of endurance. They told him that faith was not a crown but a cross, and that to carry it was to lead. Do not seek glory, she had written. Seek grace. For France was not given to us to conquer, but to guard. He folded the letter and pressed it to his lips. Outside, the camp began to chant the prayers of mourning. But Louis heard only her voice, calm, firm, eternal, echoing through his soul. In Paris, her body lay in state within the abbey she had built with her own treasury. No jewels adorned her coffin. No golden crown rested on her brow. Only a veil of white linen and a silver crucifix across her breast. The same silver that once gleamed from the throne, she had made a symbol of purity and resolve. The people came for days. Farmers, priests, widows, knights, they knelt before her bier, touched the hem of her shroud, and wept as if for a mother. For that is what she had become, the unseen guardian of every prayer uttered, every wrong forgiven, every life spared by mercy rather than fear. Above her coffin hung a single banner, the fleur-de-lis of France. Its silk shimmered faintly in the candlelight, the lilies pure against the field of blue. It was as though heaven itself had lowered its flag in mourning. When the time came for burial, the sky itself seemed to hesitate. Clouds broke apart just enough for a pale sun to fall upon the procession. The coffin was carried through the cloister, past the nuns who sang softly in Latin, their voices thin but unbroken. Each note rose like breath into eternity. They buried her at Maubuisson, beneath the floor of the chapel she had consecrated. No royal vault, no marble tomb, just a simple slab of stone carved with the words, "Here lies Blanche, Queen of France, mother of Louis, servant of God." The abbess wept quietly as the earth covered the stone. Then silence, the silence that only holiness can command. But the world she left behind did not fall silent for long. France moved forward not with triumph, but with grace. Every law she had written, every alliance she had crafted, every church she had blessed, they endured, like pillars holding up the sky. The nobles who had once defied her now spoke her name with reverence. Even her enemies, those who had called her the Iron Widow, the Castilian Serpent, now admitted that she had ruled as few men ever could. She had turned faith into order, discipline into legacy, motherhood into monarchy. Her influence became invisible but omnipresent, a ghost within every cathedral arch, every psalm chanted by candlelight, every act of justice rendered in mercy. They said that when Louis prayed, he still paused before speaking, as if waiting for a voice he could no longer hear. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of night, his counselors saw him lift his gaze toward heaven not to seek guidance, but to give thanks. Years passed, but Blanche did not fade from memory. Her portrait was painted in manuscripts, her likeness carved into stone. She was remembered not for battles, nor for wealth, but for an authority that transcended both. In every century that followed, when France trembled, her name would return whispered in council chambers, invoked by queens and reformers alike. For Blanche of Castile had left behind more than a throne. She had left an idea that power need not be cruel, that virtue could rule a world built on violence, that a woman's wisdom could shape an empire's soul. The silver throne itself, once seated in the halls of Paris, was moved to the abbey for safekeeping. Its surface, dulled by time, still reflected the faintest glimmer of light when candles burned nearby. Pilgrims came to see it not as relic, but as symbol. They said that if one stared long enough into its surface, they might see her reflection serene, composed, eternal. One legend told that on winter nights, when the abbey bells toll for midnight prayer, a soft light appears near her tomb. Not the glare of torches, but a pale silver glow like moonlight caught upon polished metal. The nuns who see it say it is the queen keeping vigil, her spirit standing guard over France. They swear that sometimes the scent of lavender fills the chapel, and the candles burn steadier, as if steadied by her unseen hand. Whether miracle or memory, none dared doubt it, for Blanche of Castile had never truly left her throne, she had only ascended it in heaven. Across the centuries, monarchs came and went. Wars rose and fell like tides. Yet in the quiet corridors of power, her shadow remained guiding, judging, reminding. Every queen who ruled after her bore the echo of her name. Every king who knelt to pray did so beneath her legacy. The silver throne endured not because of its metal, but because of the will it represented. It had belonged to a woman who proved that faith could govern as fiercely as fear, that conviction could command where armies failed. And in the end, that is how France was made, not by conquest, but by conscience. Centuries later, historians would debate her. Some would call her saintly, others shrewd. Some would see the tenderness of a mother, others the steel of a monarch. But all would agree on one truth, that France, as it came to be, was born from her shadow. Blanche of Castile, the queen who forged a saint, who ruled without armies, who held a kingdom together through prayer, diplomacy, and the ferocity of love. She was the last of an age, and the first of another, the bridge between the medieval and the divine. Her silver throne still gleams, somewhere beneath the dust of time, not in palaces, but in the memory of a nation that still whispers her name when it prays. Her throne was silver, her will unbreakable. She ruled no army, yet built an empire of conscience. And though centuries have passed, the light of her faith still crowns France. In the years after her passing, France seemed quieter, as though the land itself was catching its breath. The bells still rang from cathedrals she had built, their tones softer now, less commanding, yet filled with a haunting clarity. The people said that the sound carried her voice, distant, invisible, unyielding. Paris moved forward, markets reopened, nobles quarreled, armies marched, yet beneath every act of rule, her presence lingered. Her laws remained untouched, her decrees unchallenged. Even those who had once despised her could not bring themselves to undo her order. It was as if France itself had sworn loyalty not to the king, but to her memory. Louis returned from the east, thinner, grayer, his eyes touched with the strange calm of those who have seen both heaven and hell. He carried the relics of his crusade splinters of the true cross, dust from the Holy Land, a crown of thorns. But above all, he carried her spirit, that quiet, relentless discipline that had forged him long before any crusade. When he entered Paris, the people did not cheer as they once had. Instead, they bowed their heads, a nation still in mourning for the queen who had kept it whole. Louis walked through the gates in silence, his armor dulled, his banner lowered. In his heart he carried not triumph, but inheritance. He visited Maubuisson, first alone, without escort. The abbess opened the door with tears in her eyes, for the man before her was both king and child. He knelt beside the slab of stone that bore her name, tracing the letters with trembling fingers. Blanche, Queen of France, servant of God. The words had not faded. Neither had her presence. The air within the chapel was cool and still, filled with the scent of wax and lilies. He closed his eyes and prayed not for her soul, but to her strength. Outside, the kingdom awaited his rule. Yet Louis found himself guided not by ambition, but by memory. He ruled as she had taught him, with mercy where others demanded cruelty, with patience where others thirsted for speed, and with an unbreakable devotion to faith. His court began to notice the resemblance. He spoke as she had, walked as she had, paused in the same quiet deliberation before making judgment. In every gesture, her ghost seemed to move through him, as though France had not lost its queen at all, only seen her spirit transfigured into its king. The nobles whispered, it was unnatural that a man should be so ruled by the shadow of a woman. But the common people saw it differently. They said Blanche had not died, she had simply changed thrones. Her son's heart had become her new seat of power. Louis's reign grew radiant with holiness. He built Sainte-Chapelle, a palace of glass and light, to house the relics he had carried home. And when the sunlight poured through the crimson and sapphire windows, the court swore they saw her image reflected there, a woman's face in the glow, eyes calm, hands folded in prayer. Louis would not deny it. He would only bow his head and whisper, she is with us. Every reform, every judgment, every treaty bore her echo. The taxes she had structured continued. The schools she had funded expanded. Even the art she had patronized now flourished across France, paintings of Madonna and Child, of mothers crowned in heaven, all carrying faint traces of her likeness. Her portrait became a new iconography of power, not the cold majesty of kings, but the serene authority of faith made flesh. And through her son, the world came to understand what she had always believed. That rule was not dominion, but stewardship. But greatness, like sanctity, has a cost. The same conscience that made Louis holy also made him sorrowful. He carried her legacy like a crown of light and thorns. At night, he would retreat to his chambers, away from courtiers and bishops, and kneel in silence before a small altar where her veil was kept. There, beneath flickering candles, he prayed for guidance and forgiveness. He spoke aloud only once to his confessor, saying, "She taught me to rule in God's image, but I fear I have only ruled in hers." The confessor replied that the two were not so different. Louis smiled faintly, for he knew the truth. His mother had been his God long before he found faith. In time, the stories began. Whispers that her grave wept during storms, that soldiers who prayed at Maubuisson before battle never fell, that barren women who touched the stone at her tomb conceived within a year. The church hesitated to proclaim miracles, but the people did not wait for papal sanction. To them, Blanche was already a saint, a mother who had carried France through fire and left behind a faith stronger than stone. Louis did not contest it. He ordered that her abbey be expanded, her tomb adorned with white marble lilies. And though he never declared her canonized, he treated her memory as sacred, a private sainthood, untouched by Rome, sealed in blood and love. In the centuries that followed, chroniclers tried to untangle fact from legend. They found letters written in her hand, commands, prayers, fragments of advice. Each line revealed the same balance of grace and steel. She spoke of humility and obedience, yet wielded both as instruments of rule. They found accounts from ambassadors who had met her. "A woman of calm eyes and iron voice," one wrote. "She listens like a priest and commands like a king." Others described her as austere, even cold, a queen who smiled rarely and loved fiercely. But all agreed that she was unlike any ruler before or after her, both saint and strategist, both mother and monarch. Over time, the abbey became a pilgrimage site. Pilgrims arrived barefoot, clutching candles and prayers, whispering pleas to the Queen of Mercy. They said she interceded in silence, that prayers spoken in her chapel seemed to echo longer, linger deeper. It was as if the walls themselves remembered her voice. Women, especially, came to her queen seeking wisdom, peasants seeking courage, widows seeking strength. They knelt at her tomb, tracing the carved lilies with trembling fingers, asking to be heard. And somehow, they believed they were. Blanche had ruled men in life. In death, she ruled hearts. Louis, older now, would sometimes visit Maubuisson again. He came not as king, but as son, slipping quietly into the chapel at dusk. He would sit by her tomb and speak softly, as though to an unseen counselor. His reign was celebrated as just and holy. But in these moments he seemed only a child again, the boy who had once held his mother's hand and learned that power could be mercy. And when he rose to leave, he always did so the same way, turning once to bow, whispering words no one could hear. Those close to him believed it was a prayer, but those who knew his heart understood it was thanks. In Blanche's legacy, France found its soul. The nation that had once torn itself apart with feudal greed now stood as the moral center of Christendom. Cathedrals rose, learning flourished, charity spread. And though kings and crusaders claimed the glory, the foundation beneath it all was hers, laid stone by stone, decision by decision, prayer by prayer. The silver throne, once merely a seat of rule, became a relic. It stood within the Louvre not as a monument to wealth, but as a symbol of moral authority. Courtiers would approach it with reverence, bowing before they spoke, as though the spirit of the queen might still be listening. And sometimes, when the candles flickered just so, one could swear they saw the reflection of a woman's eyes, in the polished silver calm, knowing, eternal. She ruled no army, yet built an empire of conscience. In life, she forged a king. In death, she forged a nation. And in both, she left a shadow that no crown could escape. Time, relentless and unfeeling, swept forward, yet it never erased her. The France that Blanche had built endured beyond her son's reign, its roots buried deep beneath the cathedrals, courts, and cloisters she had shaped. Generations passed, kings came and went, but every ruler who touched that silver throne carried, whether they knew it or not, her invisible weight. Even as the age of knights began to fade, and the world's borders widened beyond Europe, the memory of the Queen remained not as a ghost, but as a presence. Chroniclers who wrote of Louis the Saint always spoke her name first. He was her work, they would write. He was the son of Blanche before he was the King of France. The centuries polished her legend. What had once been the stern resolve of a regent became the calm virtue of a saint. Her austerity softened in memory, her sharpness reimagined as divine wisdom. And as history often does, the world remembered the myth far longer than the woman. Yet those who truly studied her, those who read her letters and her decrees, found something more complex, more human. Blanche had not been born holy. She had been forged by necessity, tested by betrayal, and refined by purpose. Her faith was not meek submission, but chosen strength, the courage to place her will beneath something greater and make that humility her weapon. That paradox became the foundation of France's moral monarchy. From her, the Capetian line learned that power need not be cruelty, that piety could coexist with authority, and that mercy in the right hands could rule an empire as firmly as the sword. In the great tapestry of Europe, where empires rose and fell like tides, Blanche's influence ran beneath the surface like a hidden river. Kings of England studied her diplomacy. Queens of Spain invoked her discipline. Even the popes who had once opposed her later cited her reign as proof that divine order could exist on earth. When the chronicler Joinville, the close friend and biographer of Louis IX, wrote of the sainted king's youth, his words carried quiet awe. The queen, his mother, was of such wisdom that all men feared and loved her. She raised the king not to rule, but to serve God in ruling. That line would echo for centuries, a mother's lesson that became a nation's creed. But history, like faith, is never static. By the dawn of the Renaissance, her image had transformed again. Painters began to depict her not merely as a queen or mother, but as an archetype, the embodiment of divine femininity. In frescoes and altarpieces, she appeared robed in silver, holding a lily in one hand and a crown in the other, the virgin strength merged with a monarch's authority. In this new world of light and learning, Blanche became something more than historical. She became moral architecture. Her story was taught not as politics, but as principle, the tale of a ruler who governed as both parent and prophet. Even as kings grew secular and empires turned toward ambition, her quiet example remained the shadow of conscience behind their crowns. Yet, for all her sanctity, Blanche's true power had always been practical. Her understanding of order, of law and loyalty, laid the groundwork for the administrative France that would endure into the modern age. She had centralized power not for vanity, but for survival, uniting feudal chaos beneath the calm discipline of the crown. What began as necessity became destiny. Without Blanche, there would have been no Louis the Saint. And without Louis, perhaps no France as we know it. Even revolution, when it finally came centuries later, could not erase her entirely. When mobs tore down the relics of kings, some paused before the white effigy of Blanche at Maubuisson. She had not been a tyrant. She had been a mother. Her legacy did not provoke hatred, it inspired reflection. For even in the age of reason, the idea of a ruler guided by moral duty remained sacred. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, told by a monk of the 17th century. He claimed that during a great storm, lightning struck near Maubuisson and shattered part of the abbey's roof. The next morning, the brothers entered the chapel expecting ruin. But beneath the broken beams and scattered stones, Blanche's tomb lay untouched. Even the candle at its head still burned. The monk wrote, "I believe then that God protects what he claims as his own. The Queen of France rests not in death, but in his keeping." And so she remained in stories, in prayers, in marble and memory. Her image, carved into the annals of history, became a mirror through which France measured its own soul. Was it still the kingdom she had dreamed of? Did its rulers still serve God before themselves? These questions echoed through every age, through crusade and schism, through enlightenment and revolution. Even now, in quiet chapels and museums, her presence lingers. A portrait hangs in the Louvre. A woman in white, eyes calm, lips faintly curved a smile that is both kind and knowing. Visitors pass it every day, unaware that they stand before the architect of France's moral identity. Yet if one lingers, if one truly looks, the silence around her seems to shift as though the centuries themselves are listening. Her story endures because it defies the simplest truths. She was both humble and proud, both servant and sovereign. Her piety did not make her gentle, and her power did not make her cruel. In Blanche, contradiction became harmony. She was the embodiment of balance between faith and will, between womanhood and rule. Even her enemies, long dead, left grudging tributes in their chronicles. She ruled with a man's courage and a woman's heart, one wrote, and where others sought glory, she sought order and found eternity. In the end, that was her greatest victory. Not conquest, not wealth, not even sainthood, but endurance. The endurance of a legacy built not on fear, but on conviction. The endurance of a moral empire, stronger than any army, and the endurance of a mother's hand, still guiding a nation through the centuries. The silver throne may have tarnished, its surface dulled by time and touch, but beneath the dim light of 1,000 candles, it still gleams faintly, a reminder of the woman who once sat upon it, and the world she remade from it. Her story closes not in death, but in reflection. Blanche of Castile, queen, regent, mother, architect of saints, the woman who turned devotion into dynasty and duty into destiny. France remembers her not as the wife of a king, but as the mother of a kingdom. And in that remembrance, she lives. Quiet, watchful, eternal. The candlelight that had once flickered in Blanche's abbey spread far beyond the stones of Maubuisson. It became something greater, an inheritance of light passed from century to century, through the hearts and hands of those who ruled, those who prayed, and those who remembered. Even when the abbey's walls crumbled, the spirit she had built into the kingdom remained like the echo of a hymn no fire could silence. France changed, but her shadow endured. From the coronation of her grandson to the dawn of the Renaissance, the idea of monarchy she had shaped, moral, dutiful, absolute in conscience, became the blueprint for kings and queens to come. It was a monarchy built not on the chaos of power, but on the discipline of faith. Even as crowns passed and banners shifted, the question lingered in every ruler's heart. What would Blanche have done? Louis IX, her son, her masterpiece, lived on as the living symbol of her will. His piety became legend. His justice became doctrine. His reign became the gold standard of Christian kingship. But those who knew the truth whispered that behind his sainthood stood his mother's hand, steady, unseen, indelible. When Louis walked barefoot through the streets of Paris to feed the poor, when he judged his nobles beneath the oak at Vincennes, when he forbade blasphemy and defended the weak, he was not merely acting as a king. He was completing his mother's design. The people adored him, the church canonized him, and history crowned him St. Louis. Yet even his canonization bore her reflection. For who taught him that power without virtue was sin? Who taught him that the crown was not a privilege, but a penance? It was Blanche the mother, whose faith became his foundation, whose strength became his morality. Her victory, then, was eternal. For through Louis, she transformed monarchy itself, turning kingship into stewardship, power into devotion. France would forever measure its rulers against that impossible light, the queen who raised a saint, and the saint who ruled a kingdom. Yet time, like the tide, wears away even marble. The medieval order she had fortified began to shift. The centuries grew restless. New minds, new voices, new ambitions began to question the divine order Blanche had built. Still, even as philosophy and reason challenged faith, her influence endured, woven deep into the French idea of justice and identity. When kings spoke of duty, when priests preached of sacrifice, when scholars wrote of the moral right to rule, they all spoke Blanche's language, though few remembered its source. Her legacy was no longer only in cathedrals or chronicles. It lived in the architecture of France itself, the balance between law and grace, between might and mercy. In every royal seal stamped with a fleur-de-lis, in every sermon echoing the idea of sacred kingship, her spirit remained. In the age of Charles V, the wise king, echoes of her governance returned. Charles rebuilt France after war and ruin by enforcing order through intellect and faith, a reflection of Blanche's visions centuries earlier. He, too, preferred books to blood, diplomacy to destruction. And in his court, chroniclers praised Blanche by name once more, calling her the mother of France's reason. Then came the Valois, and their glittering, fragile splendor. The royal courts filled with poets and painters, yet beneath their silken ceremony lay Blanche's unyielding discipline, the quiet belief that France was not merely a realm, but a sacred trust. Even the Renaissance, with its celebration of man over God, could not erase her entirely. Michel de Montaigne, the philosopher of doubt, once wrote, "Virtue without power is fragile, yet power without virtue is poison." Blanche of Castile proved that the one may sanctify the other. It was as though her ghost whispered through the ages, soft, reasonable, unanswerable. But her greatest echo came much later, in the time of kings who had never known her name, yet ruled beneath her principles. In the age of Louis XIV, the Sun King, when Versailles shimmered with golden mirrors, even there, her reflection gleamed faintly beneath the surface. Louis XIV ruled as if ordained by God, yet within his absolutism lay a trace of Blanche's divine order, the belief that the king's authority was not his own, but heaven's mandate. He claimed it as his birthright, she had wielded it as her burden. And though their styles could not have been more different, both reigned with the same conviction that France was not a mere land, but a covenant. The historians of that era wrote of Blanche again, this time not as a mother, but as an ideal. A woman who had ruled without vanity, whose throne had shone not with gold, but with grace. In an age where power had become theater, she remained the script. Then, the world changed once more. Faith fractured, thrones trembled. The age of reason turned its gaze from heaven to humanity. The revolution came like fire, devouring all that seemed eternal. Kings fell, queens wept, and cathedrals bled. Yet even in that chaos, Blanche's legacy was not entirely destroyed. In the National Assembly, where men debated the new soul of France, one deputy stood and spoke of the duty of conscience, of moral governance, of the sacred trust between ruler and ruled. His words, though born of liberty, carried her cadence. The crowd cheered, not realizing they were applauding the ghost of a medieval queen. Because Blanche's gift to France was not monarchy, it was morality. She had proven that authority, to endure, must be bound to virtue. That lesson outlived crowns, churches, and kings. In later centuries, poets and historians sought her again. Victor Hugo called her the mother of France's soul. A young historian named Michelet wrote, "When France was still a child, Blanche of Castile taught her to pray, to think, and to endure." Painters revived her likeness, serene, distant, illuminated by silver halos rather than golden crowns. To the Romantics, she was not a monarch of flesh and blood, but of principle, the embodiment of devotion made rule. Even modern France, secular and free, still bore traces of her, in its laws that balanced justice with mercy, in its national character, proud yet moral, passionate yet disciplined. In every echo of its motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, one can still hear the faint rhythm of Blanche's faith. Order, virtue, unity. Blanche had reigned in a world that believed women were meant to pray, not rule to follow, not lead. Yet she had led without defiance, ruled without rebellion. Her power had come not from rejecting her place, but from redefining it. That subtle revolution would echo through queens long after her. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of Castile, Elizabeth of England, Catherine of Russia. All would wield the same paradox: feminine strength wrapped in divine purpose. In them, as in Blanche, the line between virtue and power blurred into brilliance. Now, 8 centuries later, her story remains one of Europe's great paradoxes, a queen whose greatest triumph was restraint, whose deepest weapon was conscience. In a world of empires forged by blood, she built hers from faith. And when her light seemed lost, it was only because it had become too deeply woven into the world to be seen. Empires fall, crowns shatter, names fade. But every nation that seeks to rule with justice, to lead with mercy, and to believe in something greater than itself, lives in the reflection of Blanche of Castile. The centuries rolled forward like tides against stone, washing the memory of Blanche into the deeper layers of Europe's conscience. Her abbey fell to ruin. Her name faded from the lips of kings. Yet her essence lingered, quiet, indestructible. For some legacies live not in monuments, but in the moral gravity they leave behind. Even the modern world, armored in glass, reason, and rebellion, carries fragments of her faith. In the chambers of justice, where men speak of duty before law, in the silent chapels of Paris, where candles still burn for lost souls, in the gentle insistence that power must serve something greater than itself, Blanche's reflection is there not in the splendor of thrones, but in the flicker of conscience that survives every empire. When the cathedrals she had strengthened were bombed and rebuilt through the wars of the 20th century, the people of France spoke again of resilience, of unity, of grace under fire. And though her name was seldom mentioned, her spirit was felt, the steadfast mother who had once held the kingdom together by faith alone. For every time France was brought to its knees, whether by plague, invasion, or ideology, it found a way to rise, not in rage, but in dignity. That was her inheritance to them. Not victory, but endurance. Not conquest, but conscience. In Paris, a statue still stands within the shadowed aisles of Notre Dame, a queen kneeling, her hands clasped in prayer. Few tourists stop to read the inscription. Fewer still understand that this was the woman who once ruled their world. But the stone remembers. Each curve of her marble face bears the echo of centuries. The wars she prevented, the peace she preserved, the saint she raised. Even now, as the cathedral rises again from its own ashes, her likeness remains unbroken, unburned. In the modern age, where power is measured in influence and faith in data, Blanche's story feels almost impossible, a myth of virtue surviving in a cynical world. Yet that impossibility is precisely what makes her eternal. She was never meant for the age of headlines or slogans. She was a creature of prayer and paradox, ruling not by force but by patience, a form of power the modern world has forgotten how to see. But those who still study her reign, those who look beyond the chronicles, find something revolutionary beneath her serenity. Because in the end, Blanche of Castile did what no conqueror ever could. She made morality political. Her philosophy of rule was deceptively simple: that kings are not masters of men, but servants of God. That authority is not inherited, but earned through justice. That the throne is not a privilege, but a duty. These ideas, centuries ahead of their time, would shape Europe's conscience long after the age of divine right had died. Even the Enlightenment, which sought to replace faith with reason, carried traces of her thought, though transformed. The notion that rulers must be moral, that power must answer to ethics, that the state must serve the soul of its people, these were Blanche's gifts, reforged in the language of philosophy. She had turned faith into a framework. And when faith itself fell from favor, the framework endured. If Machiavelli was the father of modern politics, Blanche of Castile was its conscience. Where he taught princes to rule through fear, she had shown that power could command through grace. Where he praised cunning, she embodied conviction. In her, the lion met its mirror and saw itself tamed. For centuries, Europe would oscillate between these two poles, the ruthless and the righteous, the fox and the saint. And at the center of that moral pendulum sat the silent, silver figure of a woman who had once knelt before God and whispered, "Thy will be done." In the hush of the modern evening, as the lights of Paris shimmer upon the Seine, the echoes of her age seem distant, yet strangely familiar. The bells of Notre Dame ring not for kings, but for the collective soul she once guarded. The great avenues of the capital lead not to palaces, but to parliaments, yet the same question endures. Can power be moral? Blanche answered at once, not with words, but with life. She proved that righteousness, though mocked, can rule, that the gentlest voice can outlast every shout of war, and that a woman, in an age of men, could hold a kingdom together with nothing but her will. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of the French countryside, an ancient abbey still breathes in the wind. Maubuisson, her creation, her sanctuary. The walls are pale and worn, but when the sunlight passes through its narrow windows, the stones glow faintly as though remembering her. The air smells of moss and incense. Pilgrims no longer come here, but travelers sometimes pause, sensing the weight of something sacred. And if one listens closely, beneath the birdsong and the rustle of leaves, one might hear it, the faint whisper of a woman's prayer carried across 8 centuries. Not for her crown, not for her son, but for the soul of France, the woman who forged a saint, the mother who ruled a kingdom, the queen who built an empire of conscience. That is Blanche of Castile, not a relic, but a revelation. Her story is not confined to the Middle Ages. It belongs to every age that seeks to reconcile power with purpose. For she stands as proof that faith can shape nations, that virtue can defy history, and that even in the darkest of times, the light of conviction can never truly die. And so, as this tale closes, imagine again that silver throne, not of metal, but of meaning, its surface reflecting the light of the world it once ruled, its seat empty now, waiting for the next soul brave enough to govern not with power, but with conscience. When kings were lions and empires devoured the earth, one woman ruled through prayer. Her throne was silver, not for its shine, but for its reflection. In it we see ourselves, our hunger for justice, our longing for order, our fear of chaos. And perhaps even now, as the world trembles beneath the weight of its own ambition, we need her more than ever. Blanche of Castile, the queen who made France eternal. If her story moved you, if her strength reminded you that virtue still matters, keep her light alive. Like, share, subscribe, and join us where history breathes, where faith and power collide, and where the echoes of queens still rule the hearts of men.